I am Naomi, 32 years old, and the founder of a billion-dollar private equity firm. 5 years ago, my husband handed me divorce papers at our anniversary dinner because his tech startup hit a $50 million valuation, and he said he could not have a lazy, ambitionless wife dragging down his brand. His mother stood up in the crowded restaurant and cheered, announcing that her son was finally free of a freeloader. He smirked and handed me the $2,000 dinner bill before walking out. He had no idea that his entire tech company was silently funded by my private equity firm and that I was about to freeze every single asset he thought he owned. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family who completely underestimated your worth. Growing up, I learned early on that people only respect what they can see. I applied that lesson to my career, but I made the mistake of hiding my success from my husband, Derek. We met 6 years ago in Atlanta. I was 26 and starting my career in finance while he was 28, and full of dreams about building a tech empire. When we married, I wanted him to love me, for me, not for my portfolio. So I kept my professional life quiet. I told him I worked a mid-level administrative job at a financial firm. In reality, I was building Apex Financial, a private equity firm that would soon manage billions in assets. For 5 years, I played the role of the supportive, quiet wife. I managed our household, I listened to his endless pitches, and when he could not find investors for his startup, I quietly directed my firm to inject capital into his company through a blind trust. I was his angel investor, his sole financial lifeline, but he thought he was a self-made genius. His ego grew with every funding round I secretly approved. He started wearing tailored suits, driving luxury cars, and treating me like an embarrassing relic from his past. Our 5th anniversary dinner was supposed to be a celebration. I rushed straight from my office wearing a simple navy dress that Derek always said made me look like a bored secretary. I arrived at the high-end steakhouse in Buckhead expecting a romantic evening. Instead, I found Derek sitting at a large round table with his mother, Beatrice. Beatrice was a woman who wore her perceived social status like a weapon, always draped in ostentatious jewelry and dripping with condescension. I took my seat feeling the immediate chill in the air. Derek did not stand to greet me. He did not offer a kiss or a happy anniversary. He just stared at me with a cold, calculating expression. He reached into his designer jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope, sliding it across the white tablecloth. I asked him what it was, assuming it was some new business contract he wanted me to file. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "I am filing for divorce, Naomi," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "My startup just hit a $50 million valuation. The board wants me to relocate to Silicon Valley next month to prepare for our next major expansion. I am entering a new stratosphere of wealth and influence, and I cannot have a lazy, ambitionless wife dragging down my brand. You lack the drive and the sophistication required to be the partner of a tech CEO." I sat there staring at the man I had loved, the man whose entire empire was built on my secret financial backing. He actually believed he had outgrown me. He honestly thought his $50 million valuation was the result of his own brilliance and not the direct result of my algorithms and my capital. Before I could even process the audacity of his speech, Beatrice stood up. She grabbed her crystal champagne flute and clinked it loudly with her fork, drawing the attention of every wealthy patron in the dining room. Finally, she announced, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "My son is free of this freeloader. I always told you, Derek, you were destined for greatness, and she was nothing but dead weight holding you back." The humiliation was intentional. They wanted to break me in public. Derek smirked, clearly enjoying the spectacle his mother was creating. He signaled the waiter, who brought over the leather checkbook. The bill for their extravagant celebration of my disposal came to $2,000. Derek casually pushed the leather folder toward me. "You can cover this one, Naomi," he said smoothly. "Consider it a parting gift for all the years I provided for you. I will have my assistant send for the rest of my things tomorrow." He stood up, kissed his mother on the cheek, and walked out of the restaurant, leaving me alone under the stares of dozens of strangers. I did not cry. I did not scream. I calmly reached into my purse, pulled out my personal black card, and paid the bill. I tipped the waiter, generously smiled, and walked out into the warm Atlanta night. I drove back to our shared luxury home in the suburbs, a house I had allowed Derek to put in his name to boost his fragile ego while I quietly paid the mortgage. I expected the house to be empty so I could pack my personal belongings in peace. I was wrong. As I opened the front door, I heard loud voices and laughter coming from the living room. Derek's sister Kendra and her husband Brad were already there. Brad was an arrogant corporate loan officer who always looked at me like I was something he scraped off his shoe. Kendra was 30 years old and spent her days living off the allowance Derek gave her from his startup funds. When I walked into the hallway, I saw them tearing through my belongings. They had dragged my carefully hidden designer bags and expensive shoes out of my closet and were unceremoniously throwing them into cheap cardboard boxes. "Well, look who finally showed up!" Brad laughed, tossing one of my silk scarves onto the floor. "Derek called us from the restaurant. He said you would probably be crying your eyes out. He told us to come over and make sure you packed up your sad little wardrobe and got out tonight. He said I can take over your home office for my new day trading desk." Kendra sneered, holding up a relatively inexpensive handbag I had bought years ago. "Seriously, Naomi," she mocked. "You are going to need to find a new sugar daddy quick if you want to survive. Derek is done funding your lazy lifestyle. Try not to scratch the hardwood floors on your way out, sweetheart." The sheer entitlement was staggering. They were kicking me out of my own home, stealing my possessions, and mocking my supposed poverty. I looked at Brad, who was eagerly pacing the room like he had just won the lottery. I did not argue. I did not shed a single tear or offer them the satisfaction of my anger. I simply walked past them into the office. I ignored the boxes they had packed. I walked straight to my desk and unplugged my encrypted corporate laptop, sliding it safely into my leather tote bag. That laptop contained the master access keys to the Apex Financial Holding Trust. It was the only thing in this house that actually mattered. Leaving the boxes of clothes and bags behind, I turned and walked toward the front door. Brad watched me leave, a triumphant grin on his face. He walked over to the smart home tablet mounted on the wall. "Watch this," he bragged to Kendra. Derek gave me master access. He tapped the screen, initiating a full system lockout, erasing my fingerprints and access codes from the house security system. "You are officially locked out, Naomi," he called after me. "Have fun at the Motel 6. I stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door shut behind me. As I walked down the driveway toward my car, I could hear Brad through the open living room window. "Let us celebrate," he shouted. Derek left his diamond corporate card on the counter. "I am ordering 3 bottles of Dom Perignon through the concierge app." I sat in my car and started the engine. Through the window, I watched Brad confidently swipe Derek's heavy metal corporate card through the smart tablet reader. A second later, I heard him curse loudly. I knew exactly what he was looking at. The tablet screen was flashing a bright red error message. "Account terminated by parent holding company." I pulled out of the suburban driveway and headed toward the highway. I was not driving to a cheap motel. I merged onto the interstate and headed straight for the heart of downtown Atlanta. 30 minutes later, I pulled into the private underground parking garage of a glittering glass skyscraper. I took the private elevator directly to the top floor, stepping out into a $15 million high-security penthouse. This was my actual residence. The suburban house with Derek had just been a prop, a stage set for a marriage that was built on a lie. This penthouse, with its floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the Atlanta skyline, its imported Italian marble floors, and its cutting-edge security system, was the fortress I had purchased with my own hard-earned wealth. As I set my bag down on the kitchen island, my phone began to vibrate violently. It was Derek. He was blowing up my phone with furious text messages. "What did you do to my accounts? Why are my corporate cards declining? The bank says the parent trust froze everything. Fix this right now, Naomi." He was panicking. His $50 million valuation meant nothing if he could not access the operational capital to keep his doors open. I ignored his messages and walked into my master suite. I stripped off the plain navy dress, the uniform of the subservient wife he thought I was, and slipped into a flowing emerald silk designer robe. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water and walked into my true home office, a room equipped with multi-monitor trading stations and secure server access. I sat down in my leather executive chair and opened my encrypted laptop. I logged into my secure Apex financial portal, entering my biometric authorization. The dashboard loaded, displaying the massive web of investments and assets under my control. I navigated to the specific holding trust that funded Derek's startup. With a few precise keystrokes, I initiated the formal severing protocol. I permanently disconnected Derek's company accounts from my umbrella trust, citing a standard breach of morality clause embedded deep within the original funding contract. I restricted all capital flow, froze the operational credit lines, and flagged the startup for a mandatory forensic financial audit. I watched the confirmation screens pop up one by one, locking him out of his own empire. Just as I finalized the lockout, my phone buzzed with a new message. It was not from Derek. It was a picture message from his sister Kendra. I opened it and felt a brief, cold flash of disgust. It was a photo taken in the living room of the suburban house I had just left. Derek had returned, and he was standing by the fireplace passionately kissing a young blonde woman. I recognized her immediately. It was Vanessa, his 23-year-old administrative assistant. Kendra had added a caption to the photo. Out with the old boring trash and in with the new upgrade. Derek finally has a woman who matches his executive lifestyle. Enjoy being broke, Naomi. They thought this photo would break me. They thought seeing my husband of 5 years in the arms of a 23-year-old in my own living room would send me spiraling into despair. Instead, it gave me exactly what I needed. I smiled coldly, staring at the image of the cheating husband, the arrogant sister, and the foolish assistant. I took a screenshot of the message, saving it to my secure drive. Then I opened my email client and drafted a new message to my commercial real estate attorney. I attached the photo and typed a simple instruction. Execute the eviction protocol on all commercial and residential properties leased under Derek's name immediately. No extensions, no warnings. I hit send, set my phone face down on the desk, and turned to watch the city lights glittering outside my window. The war had officially begun, and Derek had no idea that he had just brought a knife to a drone strike. Monday morning arrived with a crisp edge to the Atlanta air. I sat at the mahogany desk in my penthouse sipping my espresso and pulled up the live security feeds for a premium commercial property in Midtown, a property I owned lock, stock, and barrel. Through the high-definition cameras, I watched the morning unfold exactly as I had orchestrated. At precisely 9 o'clock, Brad strutted into the gleaming marble lobby of the commercial building. He was wearing a custom-tailored suit that he undoubtedly bought on credit, and trailing behind him were 3 senior executives from a major Atlanta banking firm. Brad was talking with his hands gesturing expansively toward the frosted glass doors of Derek's tech startup. I could read his lips perfectly. He was selling them the dream, boasting about the exclusive $50 million startup he was personally managing, and how getting in on the ground floor would make them all incredibly wealthy. Brad confidently pulled his VIP Platinum Access card from his wallet and swiped it against the biometric reader next to the double glass doors. A harsh red light flashed on the scanner. Access denied. He laughed nervously, looking back at the bankers, making a quick joke about tech glitches and early morning server updates. He swiped the card again. The red light flashed a second time, followed by a loud negative buzz. He pressed his palm against the glass, peering inside the darkened lobby of the office. On the other side of the glass, Derek was already in a state of absolute panic. He was pacing the reception area, frantically tapping his phone and jiggling the handles of the interior doors, which had also been electronically sealed. Brad banged his fist against the glass, demanding to be let in so he could show his clients the server rooms. Derek just stared back at him, his face pale and sweating, gesturing helplessly that the entire system was locked down and he was trapped in the front lobby. Before Brad could throw a full tantrum, the main lobby elevator doors slid open. 4 private security contractors dressed in immaculate dark suits stepped out. They moved with military precision. The lead guard, a tall, broad-shouldered man named Hayes, carried a thick legal folder. Hayes was one of my best men at Apex Financial. I took another sip of my espresso and watched him approach the glass doors, completely ignoring Brad and his wealthy clients. Hayes bypassed the biometric scanner using a master override keycard. The heavy glass doors slid open with a soft hiss. Brad immediately tried to push past him, puffing out his chest and demanding to know what security company they were with and who gave them authorization to lock down his brother-in-law's office. Hayes placed a massive hand on Brad's chest, stopping him dead in his tracks. "You are not authorized to enter this premises," Hayes stated, his voice booming through the quiet lobby. Hayes walked straight up to Derek, who looked like he was about to pass out from the stress. Derek started screaming about how he paid his rent on time and demanded to speak to the building manager, threatening to sue the security company for harassing a multi-million-dollar tech CEO. Hayes did not blink. He handed the thick legal envelope directly to Derek's chest, forcing him to take it. "You are officially served," Hayes announced loudly, ensuring the banking executives standing out in the hallway heard every single word. "You have exactly 2 hours to vacate this property before local law enforcement is called to physically remove you and your staff." Derek ripped open the envelope, his hands shaking violently. He read the first page and his jaw dropped. "This is a mistake," he stammered, his confident CEO persona crumbling into dust. "I have a 10-year commercial lease. This building is owned by Vanguard Properties. I am their top tenant." Hayes looked him dead in the eye. "Vanguard Properties is a wholly owned subsidiary of Apex Financial. Your lease has been immediately voided due to fraudulent corporate misrepresentation and severe breaches of ethical conduct clauses. All building access has been permanently revoked. You are permitted to pack your personal items only. All corporate hardware, furniture, and server data remain on site as property of Apex Financial." Out in the hallway, Brad's banking clients heard the exact words "fraudulent corporate misrepresentation." In the financial world, those words were an absolute death sentence. The lead executive, a stern-looking man with silver hair, glared at Brad with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. He did not say a word to Brad. He did not ask for clarification. He simply turned on his heel and walked toward the exit, his associates following right behind him. Brad watched his massive commission, his reputation, and his entire banking career walk out the front doors of the lobby. The smug, arrogant mask he had worn all weekend completely shattered. All of the fake brotherhood he pretended to share with my husband vanished in a second. He realized he had staked his entire professional livelihood on a man who was nothing more than a subsidized fraud. Brad stormed through the open glass doors, ignoring the security guards, and marched straight up to Derek. Derek opened his mouth to try and explain, to offer some kind of smooth-talking excuse, but Brad was not listening. Brad lunged forward and grabbed Derek violently by the lapels of his expensive designer jacket, shoving him backward against the marble reception desk. His face was purple with rage, the veins bulging in his neck. "You told me you owned this building," Brad screamed, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "You told me you were a genius. My clients just walked out. You lied to me. You lied to everyone." Security guards stepped between Brad and Derek. Hayes grabs Brad by the shoulder and physically removes him from Derek's personal space. Derek is hyperventilating, his expensive suit wrinkled and ruined. He stumbles backward out of the glass doors and onto the busy Atlanta sidewalk. The midday sun beats down on him, but he is shivering. Vanessa steps out of the nearby coffee shop holding 2 iced lattes. She sees Derek looking like a defeated stray dog. She rushes over her high heels, clicking on the pavement. She hands him a drink, but his hands are shaking too violently to hold it. The plastic cup hits the ground, spilling cold coffee and ice over his leather shoes. Vanessa quickly pulls him away from the gawking pedestrians. She brushes the dust off his lapels, her eyes filled with arrogant determination. She tells him to stop looking so pathetic. She reminds him he is a tech visionary and that his former building was beneath his brand anyway. She promises him she can fix this. She flags down a passing black car and shoves him inside, giving the driver an address for the most exclusive commercial real estate leasing office in Buckhead. Derek sits in the back seat, rubbing his face with his trembling hands. He asks her what she is doing. He admits his accounts are frozen, and he has absolutely zero capital to secure a new office. He confesses that the venture capital meeting might be in jeopardy. Vanessa just laughs, tossing her blonde hair over her shoulder. She tells him not to worry about the money. She leans in close and whispers that she has a secret. She brags that she has a mysterious sugar daddy, a wealthy benefactor who gave her an unlimited black card for absolute emergencies. She claims the man is obsessed with her, but completely hands off, allowing her to live her life while he funds her safety net. Derek looks at her with a mix of shock and desperate relief. He is too broken to question her infidelity, too greedy to care that his mistress has another lover. He just needs a lifeline. They arrive at the Zenith Tower leasing office, a monument of glass and steel that caters only to Fortune 500 companies and elite billionaires. Vanessa struts through the lobby with unearned confidence, pulling a reluctant Derek behind her. They approach the immaculate marble reception desk. A polished leasing director wearing a sharp, tailored suit looks up from her computer. Vanessa slams her hands on the marble desk and demands an immediate tour of the top-floor corporate suite. The leasing director looks at Derek's disheveled appearance and Vanessa's aggressive posture with clear skepticism. The director politely explains that the penthouse suites require a rigorous financial background check, a multi-year commitment, and a massive upfront deposit. Vanessa smirks. She opens her designer handbag and dramatically pulls out a heavy, matte black credit card. She flashes a triumphant look at Derek, wanting to prove she is his savior. She slides the solid metal card across the smooth marble surface. She loudly instructs the director to bypass the background check and charge a full $1 million to cover the first year of the lease and the security deposit in cash. She adds a smug comment about keeping the change. Miles away in her high-security penthouse, Naomi sits perfectly still in her leather executive chair. The massive monitors on her trading desk flash with a sudden high-priority notification. Her proprietary artificial intelligence algorithm, designed to monitor every cent of her personal and corporate wealth, has detected an anomaly. An attempt to authorize a $1 million transaction at Zenith Tower Commercial Leasing. Naomi leans forward, her eyes scanning the detailed data lines streaming across the screen. She traces the origin of the card number. The truth reveals itself on the glowing monitor, and a cold, predatory smile spreads across her face. Years ago, Derek had begged her for a supplementary corporate card. He claimed he needed a backup payment method for emergency server upgrades and international vendors. Because she trusted her husband at the time, she authorized the request on a deeply secured, unlisted personal credit line. The data on the screen tells the real story. Derek had taken that ultra-premium card and forged a secondary user profile under a fake alias. He had handed that card to Vanessa, wrapping it in a grand lie. He was Vanessa's mysterious sugar daddy. Derek had used Naomi's own personal wealth to fund his mistress, pretending to be a silent, wealthy benefactor to keep the young woman hooked. And now, in a twist of absolute poetic justice, Vanessa was trying to use Naomi's money to save Derek from Naomi's retaliation. The sheer audacity of the scheme is almost impressive, but the execution is entirely foolish. Naomi does not just decline the transaction. That would be too gentle. She types a rapid sequence of commands into her encrypted terminal. She accesses the global banking network and changes the status of the black card. She bypasses the standard fraud alert and triggers a stolen asset protocol. She flags the specific card number as stolen property actively being used in the commission of severe identity theft and grand larceny. She hits the execute key and watches the digital signal fly across the city. Back in the Zenith Tower leasing office, the director picks up the heavy metal card. She slides it into the secure terminal embedded in her desk. The machine processes the chip. For 3 seconds, the lobby is completely silent. Derek holds his breath, praying for the receipt to print so he can regain his status as a CEO. Vanessa stands tall, beaming with arrogant pride, waiting to be worshipped for saving the day. The credit terminal emits a harsh, piercing electronic screech. The screen flashes brilliant crimson. The leasing director's polite customer service smile vanishes instantly. Her posture becomes rigid. She looks at the screen, reads the high-priority federal code flashing in red text, and then slowly looks up at Vanessa. The director does not say a word about the declined transaction. Instead, she opens the top drawer of her marble desk. She pulls out a pair of heavy industrial silver scissors. Vanessa scoffs and asks what the problem is, demanding that the agent run the card again. Derek takes a nervous step backward, suddenly realizing something is terribly wrong. The leasing director holds the black card up where they can both see it. With one swift, forceful motion, she clamps the heavy scissors down on the metal. A loud snap echoes through the quiet lobby as the exclusive card is sheared completely in half. The two pieces fall onto the marble desk with a pathetic clatter. Vanessa gasps in horror, screaming at the director, asking if she has any idea who her benefactor is. The director picks up her desk phone and presses a single emergency button. She looks Vanessa dead in the eye, her voice devoid of any warmth. "Ma'am, this card has been reported stolen by the primary account holder and it is currently flagged for felony identity theft. Security has locked the front doors and you are not permitted to leave the premises." Derek turns completely pale, the blood draining from his face. He looks at the severed pieces of the card on the desk. He recognizes the serial numbers. The devastating realization hits him like a physical blow. He knows exactly whose account that card is tied to, and he knows exactly who just triggered the alarm. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the lobby, the distinct wailing sound of approaching police sirens cut through the Atlanta morning air. Panic seized Derek. He realized the front doors were locked, but his survival instinct kicked in. He grabbed Vanessa's arm, shoved past the stunned leasing director, and kicked open the emergency fire exit. They sprinted into the back alley, gasping for air, officially running on borrowed time just seconds before the police breached the lobby. As the sirens converged on Zenith Tower, a different kind of alarm was being sounded across the affluent suburbs of Atlanta. Beatrice, sitting in her overly ornate living room, adjusted the ring light positioned in front of her smartphone. She checked her reflection in the screen, deliberately smudging her mascara just enough to look devastated but still photogenic. She hit the record button and began the performance of her lifetime. Tears flowed on command. Beatrice looked directly into the camera lens, her voice shaking with practiced vulnerability. She told a horrific, entirely fabricated story to her thousands of followers and the prominent members of her mega-church congregation. She claimed that Naomi, the woman they had welcomed into their family with open arms, was nothing more than a calculating gold digger. She spun a tale of how Naomi had spent 5 years pretending to be a lowly secretary, only to secretly hack into Derek's corporate accounts and steal his hard-earned fortune. Beatrice wailed about her genius son. She claimed Derek was currently destitute, the victim of a vicious corporate coup orchestrated by a bitter, jealous wife. She pleaded with her community, invoking scripture and sisterhood, asking them to rally around a brilliant African-American entrepreneur who was being destroyed by his own spouse. Below the video, she pinned a link to a crowdfunding campaign. The goal was set at $1 million. The title read, "Save Derek's Dream." Within hours, the video went viral across Atlanta's elite social circles. Naomi's personal and corporate social media accounts were flooded with thousands of hateful comments. Church members who had once smiled at Naomi during Sunday service now left vicious messages calling her a thief, a fraud, and a disgrace. Naomi's executive assistant walked into her penthouse office holding a tablet displaying the rising tide of digital vitriol and nervously asked if they should draft a press release to combat the defamation. Naomi sat behind her desk sipping a cup of matcha tea. She watched Beatrice's tearful video on silent. She did not feel a single ounce of anger. Anger was an emotion for the powerless. Naomi possessed absolute power. She instructed her assistant to ignore the comments, block the tags, and refuse all media inquiries. Public relations battles were for celebrities and politicians. Private equity titans did not argue on the internet. They spoke through acquisitions. Naomi closed the social media tab and opened a highly specialized real estate database. If Beatrice wanted to play games with public perception, Naomi would strike at the very foundation of Beatrice's social identity. For decades, Beatrice had derived her entire sense of superiority from her status as a platinum member of the Piedmont Elite Country Club. It was an ultra-exclusive, generationally wealthy establishment where Atlanta's high society gathered to see and be seen. Beatrice treated that club like her personal kingdom, holding court at Sunday brunch and looking down her nose at anyone who could not afford the exorbitant membership fees. Naomi directed her proprietary artificial intelligence to run a comprehensive financial diagnostic on the Piedmont Elite Country Club. The results populated on her screen within seconds, revealing a fascinating vulnerability. The prestigious club was struggling to maintain its pristine facade. They had recently taken out a massive mezzanine loan to fund a multi-million-dollar renovation of their golf course and dining facilities. The loan was held by a regional bank that was currently desperate to offload distressed assets to improve its quarterly balance sheet. It took Naomi exactly 14 minutes to execute the takeover. Using one of Apex Financial's anonymous holding companies, she purchased the country club's entire debt portfolio for cash. The regional bank transferred the commercial mortgage immediately. Naomi did not just own the debt, she effectively controlled the operating covenants of the entire establishment. With her new authority as the primary creditor, Naomi demanded an immediate unredacted audit of the club's membership ledger. She scrolled through the list of Atlanta's wealthiest families until she found Beatrice's name. A sharp, genuine smile touched Naomi's lips. Beatrice, the woman currently begging for $1 million on the internet, was severely delinquent on her own club dues. She had not paid her $20,000 annual assessment in 4 months. The club management, afraid of causing a scene with such a loud, prominent member, had quietly granted her an unofficial grace period. Naomi immediately drafted a binding corporate mandate to the club's board of directors and the general manager. The directive was simple and non-negotiable. All unofficial grace periods were revoked effective immediately. Any member with an account delinquent by more than 60 days was to be instantly suspended and barred from the premises. There would be 0 exceptions. The following Sunday morning arrived with brilliant sunshine and crisp weather. Beatrice stepped out of her luxury SUV dressed to the nines in a custom-tailored suit and an elaborate wide-brimmed church hat. She was accompanied by 6 of the most influential women from her mega-church congregation. These were the women who had shared her tearful video donated to her fraudulent crowdfunding campaign and spent the entire morning service showering Beatrice with sympathy and prayers. Beatrice was reveling in the attention. She played the role of the brave, heartbroken mother, perfectly dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief, while simultaneously boasting about the exclusive brunch spread waiting for them inside the club. She led her entourage up the sweeping marble steps toward the grand mahogany double doors of the Piedmont Elite Country Club, ready to hold court in her favorite dining room. As Beatrice reached for the brass handle, a tall, imposing man in a tailored security uniform stepped directly into her path. It was the club's head of security, accompanied by the general manager. Beatrice scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. She told the security guard to step aside loudly, announcing that her guests were hungry, and her usual table by the window better be ready. She tried to step around him, but the guard shifted his weight, completely blocking the entrance. The general manager stepped forward, looking incredibly tense. He held a formal, watermarked document in his hands. He spoke clearly, ensuring his voice carried over the morning breeze so that every single woman in Beatrice's church group could hear him perfectly. "Ma'am," the general manager said, his tone rigidly professional. "I am afraid I must ask you to step off the property. Your platinum membership has been indefinitely suspended." Beatrice froze. The women behind her exchanged shocked, confused glances. Beatrice let out a loud, indignant laugh, looking back at her friends as if this were a terrible, practical joke. She turned back to the manager, her voice rising in pitch, demanding to know what he was talking about. She reminded him of her status, her years of patronage, and threatened to have him fired before the appetizers were served. The general manager did not flinch. He looked her dead in the eye and delivered the fatal blow. "Your account is in severe financial delinquency. You have failed to pay your membership dues for 4 consecutive months. Per the strict mandates of the club's new ownership, all delinquent accounts are subject to immediate public barring. You are no longer welcome at the Piedmont Elite Country Club." A collective gasp rippled through the group of churchwomen. The women who had just donated to Beatrice's charity fund were now staring at her with wide, judgmental eyes, realizing the wealthy, superior matriarch they admired was secretly broke and dodging her bills. Beatrice turned completely pale. The humiliation hit her like a physical strike. Her entire social standing, built on decades of carefully crafted arrogance, shattered in front of the exact people she wanted to impress the most. She sputtered, her hands shaking violently, demanding to know who the new owners were and threatening to sue them for public defamation. The general manager folded the document and signaled the security guard to escort her down the stairs. The new primary creditor took over the debt portfolio on Friday, he stated flatly. The mandate was issued directly by the CEO of Apex Financial. Have a good day, ma'am. The air conditioning unit in room 114 of the Starlight Motor Inn rattled like a dying engine, spitting out a lukewarm breeze that smelled faintly of stale cigarette smoke and desperation. Brad adjusted the collar of his custom Tom Ford suit, wincing as the cheap synthetic fabric of the motel chair scratched against his tailored trousers. This squalid roadside dump was a humiliating fall from grace for a man accustomed to the mahogany boardrooms and glass corner offices of his elite banking firm. After the disastrous, incredibly public eviction at Derek's tech startup, Brad's compliance department had placed him on immediate administrative leave, pending a federal investigation. His reputation was in freefall. His wealthy banking clients had vanished into thin air. The only way to salvage his career and his rapidly draining bank accounts was to secure a massive private equity buyout for Derek's software, take a ridiculous finder's fee, and move to California before the dust settled in Atlanta. Derek paced the stained, mystery-spotted carpet, aggressively running his hands through his thinning hair. His designer leather shoes stuck slightly to the floor with every step. He looked like a cornered, terrified animal. Without the secret funding he now realized came from his wife, his startup was an empty, useless shell. The servers were locked inside a high-security building he could no longer access. His employees were locked out and demanding answers. He had exactly $0 in his operational checking account. Brad watched his brother-in-law hyperventilate and felt a surge of pure, unadulterated disgust. Brad had hitched his entire professional wagon to a complete fraud. But the software code itself, the raw, predictive algorithm Derek claimed to have overseen, still had market value. If Brad could pitch it to the right blind venture capital group, they could both walk away with millions and pretend this nightmare never happened. Brad had spent the last 48 hours burning every professional bridge he had left to secure this emergency video call. He had reached out to a massive, faceless Silicon Valley venture capital syndicate known in the industry only as Obsidian Horizon. They were famous for aggressive acquisitions and for keeping their lead partners completely anonymous until the final stages of negotiation. Brad had promised their intake team a proprietary financial algorithm that could predict market downturns with terrifying accuracy. He did not care that Derek was a fraud who had likely stolen the intellectual property. He only cared about the commission check that would save him from total bankruptcy. Brad slammed his hands down on the wobbly laminate table, forcing Derek to stop pacing. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at Derek's face. He ordered Derek to pull himself together, sit down in front of the cheap laptop camera, and smile like a visionary CEO. Brad meticulously explained the rules of the pitch. Derek was absolutely not to mention the frozen accounts. He was not to mention the eviction or the screaming match in the lobby. Derek was only to talk about the technology. Brad would handle the financial projections, the valuation, and the aggressive buyout terms. Derek nodded weakly, swiping a heavy bead of sweat from his forehead. The motel room felt like a sauna, but neither man dared to take off their suit jackets. They had to project absolute power, even if they were broadcasting from a roadside ruin. Brad logged into the secure video conference link provided by the investors. The laptop screen displayed a stark white waiting room with a simple message indicating the host would let them in shortly. The digital clock in the corner of the screen ticked down to exactly 2 o'clock. The silence in the motel room was deafening, broken only by the rattle of the broken air conditioner and Derek's ragged, uneven breathing. Brad adjusted his silk tie one last time. He practiced his million-dollar corporate smile. He mentally rehearsed his opening pitch, calculating exactly how he would frame the company's sudden liquidity issues as a strategic pivot requiring fast, aggressive capital. The screen flickered. The waiting room notification vanished. The video feed connected. The stark white screen was instantly replaced by a high-definition broadcast of sheer, unadulterated luxury. The camera captured a sweeping, panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline visible through massive floor-to-ceiling windows. The interior of the broadcasted room was decorated in imported marble and dark wood. It was a space that radiated absolute, untouchable wealth and power. Brad leaned closer to the screen, his polished smile ready to deploy. He fully expected to see a room full of middle-aged men in Silicon Valley fleece vests. Instead, the camera focused on a massive custom-built mahogany desk. Behind the desk sat a single figure. Naomi was wearing a flawless, tailored white silk suit that contrasted perfectly with her beautiful dark skin. Her hair was styled immaculately. She looked like the CEO of a global empire. She looked like a woman who owned the world. In her manicured hand, she held a delicate porcelain espresso cup. She took a slow, deliberate sip, her eyes staring directly into the camera lens piercing through the digital connection and staring straight into their pathetic, dingy motel room. Derek let out a sound that was half gasp, half whimper. He pushed his chair back so violently it nearly tipped over. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him a chalky, sickly gray. He recognized that office. He recognized the breathtaking penthouse view. He recognized the powerful woman he had handed divorce papers to just days ago, the woman he had called lazy and ambitionless. Brad's confident smile froze, morphing into a mask of pure confusion and rising terror. He looked from the screen to Derek, and then back to the high-definition screen. The pieces were finally falling into place in his arrogant mind. The frozen corporate cards, the sudden brutal eviction, the anonymous venture capital firm that had been so eager to hear their desperate pitch. Obsidian Horizon was not a Silicon Valley syndicate. It was a subsidiary of Apex Financial. It was a perfectly executed trap. Naomi carefully set her espresso cup down on the matching porcelain saucer. The soft clink echoed through the laptop speakers with crystal-clear audio. She folded her hands on the polished surface of her desk, leaning forward slightly toward the camera. Her expression was completely devoid of mercy. "Hello, gentlemen. Let us talk about your valuation." Derek stared at the screen as if a ghost had materialized in the pristine digital office, his vocal cords completely paralyzed. He opened his mouth, but only a dry, raspy wheeze escaped his throat. The man who had strutted through life on the fuel of unearned confidence was now a hollow shell collapsing under the weight of his own massive hubris. The cheap motel air conditioning rattled in the background, contrasting with the high-definition luxury radiating from Naomi's broadcast. Brad, however, was a different breed of desperate. He leaned aggressively into the laptop camera, his face twisting into a mask of cornered panic. He noticed the participant counter at the bottom of the screen showing 6 other silent, anonymous squares. Brad smelled blood and assumed he could outmaneuver a woman he still fundamentally underestimated. He slammed his hand hard on the wobbly laminate table, rattling the laptop. "Listen to me, gentlemen," Brad barked, addressing the silent black squares on the video feed. "I apologize for this highly unprofessional ambush. The woman you are looking at is not a lead investor. She is Derek's bitter, psychotic ex-wife. She is a scorned, unstable woman pulling a pathetic illegal stunt to ruin a multi-million-dollar deal out of pure, irrational jealousy. I demand to speak to the actual managing partners of Obsidian Horizon immediately. Disconnect her access right now." Naomi did not raise her voice. She did not frown or show even a fraction of annoyance. She simply adjusted the cuffs of her flawless silk suit and offered a smile so cold it could have frozen the sweltering Georgia sun. "Brad," she said, her tone smooth, precise, and absolutely lethal, "I am the managing partner. Obsidian Horizon is a ghost syndicate I created specifically to facilitate this exact meeting. The other 6 participants on this call are not venture capitalists. They are my senior forensic auditors, and they have spent the last 48 hours dissecting every single byte of data you so eagerly handed over to our intake portal." Naomi pressed a single key on her sleek mechanical keyboard. The video feed immediately shifted, replacing her face with a complex scrolling dashboard of source code red flag data streams and heavily highlighted financial metrics. "Let us start with your tech visionary," Naomi announced. Derek claimed his algorithm was a revolutionary proprietary predictive model. "My auditors ran a standard baseline stress test. The code is a chaotic patchwork of stolen open-source frameworks held together by digital duct tape. It has zero scalability, massive security vulnerabilities, and most importantly, it generates completely fabricated predictive results to appease early investors. Your $50 million startup is essentially an expensive digital paperweight. It is entirely worthless." Derek buried his face in his hands, letting out a muffled, pathetic sob. His empire was dead, the autopsy broadcast live in high definition. "Now, let us discuss the broker," Naomi continued, her voice slicing cleanly through the humid motel air. "Brad, when you submitted your corporate package to my firm, you granted our servers full access to your digital footprint for standard due diligence. You really should have read the terms and conditions before checking the box." The screen shifted again. This time it displayed a series of heavily encrypted banking ledgers, wire transfer receipts, and internal compliance flags. Brad's face drained of its angry red flush, turning a sickening ashen gray. His eyes darted wildly across the screen as he recognized his own hidden file names. "My artificial intelligence algorithm does not just look at the target company," Naomi explained, reclaiming the main screen with her victorious expression. "It looks at the people selling it. I see here that over the past 3 years, you have been approving high-risk commercial loans at your banking firm and skimming a steady 3% off the top into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. You have embezzled roughly $4.2 million from your own employer, Brad. You hid it well from human auditors, but algorithms do not blink, and they do not miss a single misplaced decimal." Brad stumbled backward, his chair scraping loudly against the cheap floor. He grabbed the edges of the table, his breath coming in short, erratic gasps. "You hacked me!" he screamed, pointing a trembling finger at the camera. "That is illegal. I will sue you into the ground. I will have you arrested for corporate espionage." "I did not hack anything," Naomi stated, her voice projecting absolute untouchable authority. "You voluntarily uploaded your entire corporate network drive to our secure intake portal because you were too greedy and too desperate for a commission to practice basic operational security. You handed me the murder weapon, the fingerprints, and the signed confession. And as a licensed financial institution, I am legally obligated to report severe financial crimes to the appropriate authorities, which I did exactly 7 minutes ago." The 6 silent squares on the video call vanished one by one as the forensic auditors disconnected from the server. Naomi looked at the 2 ruined men sweating in their cheap motel room. "You wanted a valuation," Naomi said softly. "Your software is worth 0. Your reputation is worth 0. And your freedom is officially expiring. Have a wonderful afternoon, gentlemen." The screen went pitch black. The call ended. The silence in the motel room was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Derek rocked back and forth on his chair, completely broken, muttering to himself. Brad stared at the dark screen, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to process the magnitude of his destruction. Then a sharp, piercing ringtone shattered the dead silence. It was Brad's cell phone sitting on the table. The caller ID flashed brightly, illuminating the dim room, Global Banking Compliance Office. Brad stared at the glowing screen, his hands trembling violently. He did not reach for it. The phone rang a second time, loud and demanding. A text message banner dropped down from his managing director. It read, "Security is waiting at your desk. Do not return to the building without a criminal defense attorney." The rain had started as a light, irritating drizzle, but was rapidly escalating into a torrential Atlanta downpour. Vanessa stood shivering under the canvas awning of her upscale midtown apartment building, clutching her white leather Goyard weekender bag. After the humiliating, terrifying escape from the Zenith Tower leasing office, she knew Derek was completely broke and facing an active police investigation. She was furiously tapping on her phone, waiting for her Uber to arrive, so she could leave him forever. Derek pulled his metallic silver Porsche Panamera up to the curb and jumped out, wiping a mixture of sweat and rainwater from his forehead. He placed a desperate, clammy hand on her shoulder, launching into a frantic monologue. He begged her not to leave, swearing the severed black card was just a banking error. He promised he could still take her to Miami for a luxurious weekend to clear their heads, insisting he had hidden operational capital and venture capitalists begging to fund him. Vanessa crossed her arms over her chest, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her designer jacket. She looked at the ruined, panicking man with pure disgust. She was about to tell him it was completely over. Then the deafening rhythmic blare of a commercial backup alarm shattered his delusions. A massive, heavy-duty flatbed tow truck reversed aggressively into the luxury apartment building's circular driveway. Bright amber strobe lights cut through the heavy gray rain, painting the wet pavement in flashing neon yellow. The truck did not stop at the visitor loading zone. It backed up perfectly, angling its hydraulic steel ramp directly toward the rear bumper of Derek's silver Porsche. Derek dropped a leather duffel bag onto the wet concrete. He marched toward the tow truck, his chest puffed out, reverting instantly to his arrogant, demanding executive persona. He shouted over the roar of the diesel engine, ordering the driver to move the massive vehicle immediately. He pointed at his watch and threatened to have the building's concierge tow the truck for blocking a private resident's driveway. A burly, broad-shouldered man wearing a reflective waterproof jacket stepped out of the driver's side door. He completely ignored Derek's screaming. He walked straight past the frantic tech bro holding a rugged industrial tablet. The repo man leaned over the hood of the Porsche, checking the vehicle identification number through the windshield. He tapped the screen on his tablet, nodded to himself, and walked to the back of the flatbed to release the heavy steel winch cable. Derek lunged forward, grabbing the repo man by the sleeve of his reflective jacket. He screamed that the car was a private corporate vehicle and demanded the man step away before he called the Atlanta police to report an attempted grand theft. The repo man did not flinch. He casually brushed Derek's hand off his sleeve with the effortless strength of someone who dealt with angry broke millionaires every single day. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick laminated clipboard, shoving it directly into Derek's chest. The repo man told Derek to read the highlighted section. He stated his voice bored and entirely professional. The vehicle was not owned by Derek. The vehicle was not leased by Derek's startup. The primary leaseholder on the contract was Apex Financial Holdings. The parent company had officially executed a terminal cancellation of the lease agreement due to gross financial delinquency and unauthorized secondary usage. The asset was slated for immediate, non-negotiable recovery. Derek stared at the paperwork. The bold black letters spelling out Apex Financial blurred in front of his eyes. Naomi had not just frozen his corporate accounts. She was actively stripping the very clothes off his back. She was taking the car. She was taking his status. She was leaving him with absolutely nothing. Panic, raw and blinding, consumed him. Derek dropped the clipboard onto the wet pavement. He lunged at the heavy steel cable, trying to physically block the repo man from attaching the winch to the undercarriage of the Porsche. He grabbed the greasy metal wire, his expensive suit jacket soaking through with rain and motor oil. He begged the man to give him 24 hours, swearing he could wire the funds by Monday morning. The repo man took a step back, pulling a heavy radio from his belt. He looked at Derek with absolute pity. He warned Derek that interfering with a lawful asset recovery was a felony. He stated clearly that if Derek did not release the cable in exactly 3 seconds, he would dispatch the local police department to arrest him for physical obstruction and assault. Derek froze. The threat of being thrown into the back of a police cruiser in front of Vanessa finally broke his resistance. He slowly let go of the metal cable, his hands covered in black grease. He stepped back, completely defeated, and watched the hydraulic winch activate. The silver Porsche was dragged forcefully up the steel ramp, the tires screeching against the wet metal. Vanessa had watched the entire humiliating spectacle from the dry safety of the apartment awning. She looked at the sports car being secured to the flatbed. She looked at the laminated repo order lying in a puddle. Then she looked at Derek. He was standing in the pouring rain, his tailored suit completely ruined, covered in grease, trembling like a frightened child. The glamorous, untouchable tech CEO was entirely gone. In his place stood a broke, desperate fraud. Derek turned to her, forcing a pathetic, watery smile. He held his hands out pleadingly. He told her they did not need the car. He suggested they just grab a taxi to the airport and figure out the Miami trip on the way. He promised her he still had a plan. Vanessa let out a sharp, mocking laugh. She did not say a single word. She walked purposefully out from under the awning, completely ignoring the torrential rain. She marched right up to the slanted bed of the tow truck, reached into the open trunk of the Porsche, and yanked her white leather Goyard bags out of the back. Derek rushed toward her, begging her not to overreact, pleading with her to trust him. Vanessa turned on her designer heel and looked at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. She pulled her smartphone from her pocket and tapped the screen twice. She informed him in a cold, flat tone that her Uber Black was exactly 1 minute away. She told him he was pathetic broke and a complete waste of her time. A sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb, its tires splashing water against Derek's ruined shoes. The driver popped the trunk. Vanessa handed her luxury bags to the driver, climbed into the warm, dry back seat of the vehicle, and firmly shut the heavy door. She did not look out the window. She did not wave goodbye. The Uber pulled seamlessly into the Atlanta traffic, disappearing into the gray storm. The massive tow truck roared to life, shifting into gear and driving away with the last remaining symbol of Derek's fake empire. Derek was left standing completely alone on the sidewalk. The freezing rain poured down his face, washing away the last shreds of his pride, as he finally realized the absolute magnitude of the war his wife had waged against him. The afternoon sun finally broke through the heavy Atlanta rain clouds, casting a brilliant golden light across the floor of Naomi's penthouse office. She sat behind her expansive desk, enjoying the absolute quiet. Her phone, resting on the polished mahogany surface, suddenly shattered the silence. The screen illuminated, displaying a name Naomi had fully expected to see before the day was over. It was Kendra. Derek's entitled, arrogant sister was calling. Naomi took a slow breath, smoothed her silk suit, and answered the call, pressing the speaker button so the shrill voice could echo through the large room. Kendra did not bother with a greeting. She launched immediately into a furious, screaming tirade. Her voice was shrill and frantic, completely lacking the smug superiority she had displayed just days ago when she was tossing Naomi's belongings into cardboard boxes. She demanded that Naomi immediately return the family heirloom jewelry. She claimed that the stunning diamond tennis necklace and matching chandelier earrings Naomi had worn to a charity gala last winter were sacred family artifacts passed down from her late grandmother. Kendra accused Naomi of being a petty common thief who had stolen the diamonds from the suburban house on her way out. She shrieked that if the velvet box was not returned by the end of the day, she would personally drive to the police station and file felony grand larceny charges against her. Naomi listened to the entire hysterical performance without interrupting. A cool, genuine smile graced her lips. She remembered that diamond set perfectly. She had purchased it for herself during a business trip to London as a reward for closing a massive corporate merger. The idea that Derek's financially illiterate family possessed heirloom diamonds of that caliber was entirely laughable. But Naomi did not point out this obvious delusion. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice to match Kendra's frantic pitch. Instead, Naomi spoke with a tone of overwhelming, cheerful compliance. She told Kendra she completely understood. She said that family history was incredibly important, and that she would never dream of holding on to something that rightfully belonged to the legacy of her in-laws. She promised Kendra that she would pack up the beautiful velvet box immediately. She assured her that a high-end private security courier would deliver it directly to Kendra's front door within the next 2 hours. Kendra let out a harsh, triumphant scoff on the other end of the line. She boasted that Naomi was finally realizing she could not bully her way out of every situation. She told Naomi she was smart to surrender the diamonds before things got ugly. Kendra hung up the phone feeling completely victorious, unaware that she had just eagerly handed Naomi the exact coordinates to execute her next tactical strike. Naomi stood up from her desk and walked toward the master bedroom. She opened her hidden wall safe and retrieved the heavy navy blue velvet jewelry box. She brought it back to her office desk and snapped the golden latch open. The diamonds caught the afternoon light, sparkling brilliantly against the dark fabric. Naomi carefully lifted the necklace and earrings from their display cushions and placed them gently into a separate, secure travel case. She left the large velvet box completely empty. She then opened her lower desk drawer and pulled out a thick file folder containing her personal financial archives. She retrieved the original heavy stock receipts from the luxury jeweler in London. The documents clearly displayed the date of purchase, the exact specifications of the diamonds, and prominently featured Naomi's name as the sole purchaser, using funds drawn directly from her personal offshore accounts. She placed the receipts and the official certificate of authenticity neatly inside the empty velvet box. But Naomi was not finished. During her comprehensive forensic audit of Derek's fraudulent startup, her artificial intelligence algorithms had flagged a massive web of unauthorized cash transfers. Derek had been aggressively funneling stolen investor capital directly into Kendra's personal bank accounts for the last 5 years. He had purchased her luxury vehicles, funded her designer shopping sprees, and covered her exorbitant mortgage payments. Kendra had happily lived the life of a wealthy socialite without ever working a single day or declaring a single cent of that funneled money to the federal government. Naomi contacted her elite team of corporate tax attorneys earlier that morning. They had already compiled a flawless, airtight dossier of Kendra's undeclared luxury gifts and phantom income. They had submitted the dossier directly to a specialized division of the Internal Revenue Service through a highly prioritized whistleblower channel. The federal agency had immediately triggered an emergency comprehensive audit. Naomi pulled a freshly printed document from her secure fax machine. It was a formal watermark notification from the Department of the Treasury. It declared that Kendra was the subject of an active federal tax evasion investigation and demanded an immediate forensic accounting of all her assets. Naomi folded the chilling federal document with precise, deliberate movements. She laid it gently on top of the jewelry receipts inside the velvet box. She closed the lid, sealing it with a soft click, and handed the package to her trusted head of security to deliver. Miles away in her overly decorated suburban home, Kendra was pacing the hardwood floors of her living room. Her husband Brad was missing, her brother Derek was ruined, and her mother Beatrice was facing public humiliation. But Kendra firmly believed she was about to secure her own salvation. She calculated the pawn value of the diamonds set in her head, dreaming of the massive payout that would allow her to maintain her lavish lifestyle and escape the collapsing ruins of her family. She convinced herself that Naomi was weak and easily intimidated. The doorbell rang, a sharp, demanding chime that echoed through the quiet house. Kendra sprinted to the entryway and yanked the heavy front door open. A stoic professional courier wearing a dark security uniform stood on her porch, holding a locked, secure bag. He held out an electronic clipboard. Kendra snatched the stylus from his hand and signed her name with a frantic, arrogant flourish. The courier unlocked the bag, handed her the heavy velvet box, tipped his hat, and walked away without uttering a single word. Kendra slammed the front door shut, her heart pounding with greedy, desperate anticipation. She practically ran to her kitchen island, setting the velvet box down under the bright pendant lights. She imagined the look of pure envy on her friends' faces when she told them she had forced her billionaire ex-sister-in-law into submission. She placed her trembling fingers on the golden latch. She pressed it and flipped the heavy lid open fully, expecting to be blinded by the brilliance of cascading diamonds. She stared down into the box. The velvet display cushion was completely bare. There was no sparkling necklace. There were no platinum earrings. There was only a neatly folded stack of premium paper resting in the center. Kendra's face contorted in profound confusion. She reached into the box and pulled the papers out, her hands shaking. She unfolded the first document. It was the London jeweler's receipt. Her eyes scanned the bold black text, landing on Naomi's name as the sole purchaser. She flipped to the next page and saw the certificate of authenticity legally binding the diamonds to Naomi's estate. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the chest. She had absolutely no legal claim to the jewelry. Her entire extortion attempt was based on a delusion. But it was the final piece of paper that truly destroyed her. She unfolded the heavy watermarked document bearing the terrifying official seal of the Internal Revenue Service. She read the bold, stark lettering announcing a formal federal audit. The document detailed a thorough investigation into massive undeclared cash transfers and luxury assets received over a 5-year period. It warned of severe financial penalties, asset seizure, and potential federal prosecution for gross tax evasion. Kendra dropped the papers onto the kitchen counter. Her legs gave out completely. She sank to the cold tile floor, clutching her chest as a raw, suffocating panic consumed her. The reality of her situation crashed down with absolute merciless finality. She was entirely broke, her husband was facing criminal charges, her brother was a penniless fraud, and now the federal government was coming to systematically strip away whatever pathetic scraps she had left. The stale, recycled air of the downtown Atlanta deposition room smelled of cheap coffee and impending desperation. Derek sat at the long mahogany conference table, aggressively bouncing his knee. Beside him sat Richard Sterling, a notoriously predatory divorce attorney known for bullying vulnerable spouses into unfair settlements. Derek had undoubtedly promised Sterling a massive contingency fee, spinning a tragic tale of how he had single-handedly funded his wife's lifestyle for 5 years while building his tech empire, only for her to maliciously lock him out of his own house. Sterling was a shark, and he was currently organizing his legal pads, fully prepared to devour a helpless, low-level administrative assistant. The heavy oak doors of the conference room swung open. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. Naomi walked in wearing a razor-sharp, custom-tailored charcoal suit that radiated absolute authority. Her posture was flawless. Her expression was an impenetrable mask of pure calm. Flanking her was Sarah, her brilliant and utterly ruthless general counsel. Sarah did not wheel in boxes of financial documents or massive legal binders. She carried only a single slim leather portfolio. Derek scoffed, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. He nudged his lawyer, whispering a smug comment about how Naomi could not even afford a real legal team. Sterling adjusted his silk tie and smiled a predatory, condescending smile. He instructed the court reporter to go on the record. Sterling immediately went on the offensive. He did not ask questions. He launched into theatrical accusations. He painted a grand, fictitious narrative for the court reporter. He described Derek as a brilliant, self-made tech visionary who had generously elevated Naomi from her pathetic, low-income life. Sterling claimed that Derek had paid for every meal, every vacation, and the very roof over Naomi's head for half a decade. He slammed his hand on the table, raising his voice to a booming, aggressive pitch. He accused Naomi of being a deceitful gold digger who had secretly funneled Derek's hard-earned startup capital into hidden personal checking accounts right before filing a frivolous divorce. Sterling leaned over the table, pointing a gold-plated pen directly at Naomi. He demanded that she surrender complete access to her measly checking accounts immediately. He threatened to drag her through years of brutal litigation. He claimed that because her malicious actions had caused Derek severe emotional distress and business disruptions, Derek was now legally entitled to massive spousal support. Sterling demanded that Naomi pay Derek alimony for the rest of his natural life, or else he would bankrupt her with legal fees. Derek sat next to his lawyer, nodding along vigorously. He looked at Naomi with a pathetic, triumphant smirk, fully believing he had finally regained the upper hand. He thought he was intimidating her into a lucrative settlement that would save him from his mounting debts. Naomi did not flinch. She did not raise her voice to defend herself. She simply blinked slowly, maintaining unwavering eye contact with the aggressive attorney. Sarah, seated next to Naomi, let out a soft, echoing laugh. It was a terrifying sound in the sterile room. Sarah calmly opened her slim leather portfolio. She addressed Sterling, her tone perfectly, even completely unbothered by his theatrical threats. She informed him that his aggressive demands for financial discovery were entirely unnecessary. She stated that her client believed in absolute transparency. Sarah extracted a single sheet of heavy watermarked paper from the portfolio. It was a heavily redacted personal tax return and a corporate Schedule K-1 document. She placed it face down on the polished mahogany and slid it smoothly across the table until it rested directly in front of Sterling. Sterling scoffed, rolling his eyes as he picked up the document. He put on his reading glasses, preparing to mock whatever insignificant administrative salary Naomi was trying to hide. He looked at the top of the page. He read the name of the primary holding company, Apex Financial Group. His eyes darted to the right, scanning the column for the stated title, Chief Executive Officer and Sole Managing Partner. His brow furrowed in sudden, deep confusion. He dragged his finger down the column, reading the list of wholly owned subsidiaries, the massive commercial real estate portfolios, and the staggering multi-billion-dollar gross adjusted income. Sterling stopped breathing. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. He looked up from the paper, staring at Naomi with wide, terrified eyes. The arrogant shark had suddenly realized he was swimming in a tank with an apex leviathan. As a seasoned financial lawyer, Sterling instantly understood the catastrophic magnitude of the situation. The woman sitting across from him was not a secretary. She was one of the most powerful private equity titans on the East Coast. Worse, he realized that the tech startup his client claimed to own was entirely subsidized by her firm. Derek had no money. Derek had no assets. Derek had committed flagrant perjury by lying about his financial status. And he had just weaponized Sterling to extort a billionaire who possessed enough legal and financial firepower to have Sterling completely disbarred and utterly ruined before lunchtime. Derek noticed his lawyer's sudden paralyzing silence. He leaned over, trying to look at the paper, asking what the document said. He arrogantly told Sterling to stop wasting time and demand the settlement check. Sterling did not answer him. He took off his reading glasses with trembling hands. He shoved the redacted tax return back across the table as if it were radioactive. Without a single word, he began aggressively shoving his legal pads and gold-plated pens into his expensive briefcase. Derek panicked, grabbing Sterling by the arm, demanding to know what he was doing. He reminded the lawyer of the massive contingency fee they had discussed. Sterling forcefully ripped his arm away from Derek's grasp. He snapped his briefcase shut with a loud, echoing crack. He looked down at Derek with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror and absolute rage. "I quit. You lied to me about who she is." Sterling turned on his heel and practically sprinted out of the conference room. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind him, leaving a suffocating dead silence in his wake. Derek sat completely frozen in his chair, staring at the closed doors. He slowly turned his head back to the table, looking at the two powerful women sitting across from him. He was completely alone, entirely broke, and utterly defenseless. Beatrice had spent the last 48 hours spiraling into a state of absolute unhinged desperation. Her public expulsion from the Piedmont Elite Country Club had completely severed her from Atlanta high society. Her phone calls to her wealthy friends went straight to voicemail. Her megachurch congregation treated her like a contagious disease. She firmly believed that Naomi was entirely responsible for this sudden string of terrible luck. Beatrice convinced herself that Naomi, acting out of pure spiteful jealousy over the divorce, had somehow used her low-level administrative position to sabotage the family finances. Armed with blinding arrogance and a complete detachment from reality, Beatrice drove her aging luxury SUV directly into the heart of the Atlanta financial district. She parked illegally in a loading zone, uncaring about the parking ticket. She marched through the torrential rain and pushed her way through the heavy revolving glass doors of the towering skyscraper where she knew Naomi worked. Beatrice stomped across the lobby, her wet heels clicking aggressively against the imported Italian marble floor. She approached the massive, immaculate reception desk. A highly polished receptionist named Claire looked up, offering a calm, practiced smile. Beatrice did not offer a greeting. She slammed her hand down on the polished stone counter and demanded to speak to the general manager, the director of human resources, or whoever was in charge of terminating low-level employees. Claire maintained her perfectly professional demeanor, asking Beatrice to provide the name of the employee in question. Beatrice scoffed loudly, ensuring her voice carried across the quiet, cavernous lobby. She launched into a vicious, theatrical rant. She announced to everyone within earshot that she was there to file a catastrophic complaint against a deceitful, lazy administrative assistant named Naomi. Beatrice shrieked that Naomi was a thieving gold digger who had maliciously stolen funds from her genius tech CEO son. She demanded that security be called immediately to drag Naomi down to the lobby, strip her of her security badge, and throw her out onto the street where she belonged. Claire did not interrupt the frantic performance. She quietly typed a rapid sequence of commands into her keyboard, silently alerting the executive security detail on the top floor. She waited for Beatrice to completely run out of breath. Then Claire looked Beatrice directly in the eye. "Ma'am," Claire stated, her voice devoid of any warmth or intimidation. "There are no low-level administrative assistants by that name employed anywhere in this building." Beatrice let out a harsh, mocking laugh. She accused the receptionist of covering for a criminal. She insisted that she knew exactly where her worthless daughter-in-law worked, loudly threatening to call the police if the management team did not come down to the lobby this very second. Claire stood up slowly from behind her desk. She gestured gracefully with her open hand. She politely asked Beatrice to take a step back, turn around and look directly at the primary feature wall of the corporate lobby. Beatrice rolled her eyes indignantly. She spun around on her wet heels, preparing to unleash another wave of screaming insults. She looked up at the towering solid slab of black marble that spanned the entire width of the grand foyer. Mounted directly into the dark stone were massive illuminated solid gold letters. The signage was 40 feet wide and completely impossible to miss. It read, "Naomi Holdings Group." Beatrice stared at the glowing gold letters. Her brain violently rejected the visual information, struggling to process the absolute undeniable reality staring her in the face. The massive multi-billion-dollar corporate entity that occupied this entire glass and steel skyscraper was literally named after the woman she had come to get fired. The woman she had insulted, mocked, and treated like an unwanted servant for 5 years was not a struggling clerk. She was the sole owner of the entire financial empire. A high-strained gasp escaped Beatrice's throat. The color instantly drained from her face, leaving her a sickly shade of chalk. Her designer handbag slipped from her trembling fingers and crashed loudly onto the polished marble floor. She began to hyperventilate. Her arrogant rage morphed instantly into pure, suffocating panic. She realized with terrifying clarity that she had just marched into the absolute epicenter of Naomi's power and loudly demanded the owner be terminated. Beatrice dropped heavily to her knees right in the middle of the lobby. She began to sob hysterically, screaming at the top of her lungs about how this could not be happening. She wailed to the ceiling, begging the universe to reverse this waking nightmare. She cried out about losing her precious country club, her home, and her social status, realizing she was entirely at the mercy of the billionaire she had ruthlessly tormented. 2 imposing security guards in tailored dark suits stepped smoothly out of a nearby private elevator. They did not ask questions. They grabbed Beatrice firmly by the arms, hauling her dead weight up from the marble floor. Beatrice thrashed and screamed wildly, begging the guards to let her take the elevator upstairs. She cried out that she was Naomi's mother-in-law, that she deserved respect, and that she just needed one chance to apologize and beg for her life back. The guards ignored her frantic pleading completely. They marched her forcefully toward the front of the building. The revolving glass doors spun rapidly as they shoved the hysterical, sobbing woman out of the climate-controlled lobby. Beatrice stumbled hard onto the wet concrete outside. A heavy, freezing Atlanta rainstorm was pouring down from the dark sky. The icy water instantly soaked her ostentatious church outfit and ruined her meticulously styled hair. She dropped to the pavement, weeping uncontrollably into her hands, completely shattered and humiliated in the middle of the financial district. Through the heavy sheet of rain, a pair of ruined, waterlogged designer leather shoes stepped slowly into her field of vision. Beatrice sniffled and looked up the expensive mascara running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. Standing right in front of her on the wet sidewalk was Derek. Derek was entirely drenched. He had walked all the way from the downtown deposition center in the freezing rain after his lawyer abandoned him. His expensive tailored suit was plastered to his shivering skin. He looked utterly broken, staring up with dead, hollow eyes at the towering glass monument to his ex-wife's absolute, untouchable power. He had dragged himself here trying to muster the last remaining shreds of his courage, hoping to walk inside, get on his hands and knees in the lobby, and beg the billionaire he once called lazy for a predatory loan, just to keep himself out of federal prison. Mother and son stared at each other in the pouring rain. They were both shivering violently in the cold, entirely stripped of their arrogance and their pride, completely and permanently locked out of the kingdom they had foolishly thrown away. Brad had not slept in 3 days. The arrogant, slick corporate loan officer who had mocked Naomi while packing up her designer bags was entirely gone. In his place sat a desperate, cornered animal. His custom-tailored suit was wrinkled and smelled faintly of sour sweat. His hands shook violently as he sat in the pristine temperature-controlled waiting area of the Naomi Holdings Group executive floor. He had begged the lobby security for an audience, claiming he possessed critical intelligence regarding the ongoing federal investigation into Derek's startup. Naomi, always appreciating a highly profitable betrayal, had authorized his clearance. The heavy frosted glass doors to the inner sanctum slid open. 2 security contractors escorted Brad into the massive corner office. Naomi sat behind her imposing mahogany desk, radiating absolute terrifying calm. She wore a sharp crimson silk blouse and held a silver fountain pen. Sitting to her right was Sarah, her utterly ruthless general counsel, who did not bother to look up from the legal pad she was reviewing. Brad practically collapsed into the leather guest chair. He did not wait for an invitation to speak. He leaned forward, resting his trembling hands on the polished wood of Naomi's desk, and launched into a frantic, breathless plea for salvation. He confessed everything. He told Naomi that the federal compliance officers at his banking firm were preparing to hand him over to the FBI for the millions he had embezzled. He admitted that his entire career was completely incinerated. But then Brad played his final pathetic card. He turned his sights entirely on the family he had married into. He threw Derek directly under the bus. Brad frantically pulled a silver USB drive from his pocket and slid it across the desk toward Naomi. He told her the drive contained every single piece of communication he had ever shared with Derek. He claimed he had audio recordings of Derek openly bragging about forging financial documents and routing stolen investor capital through offshore shell companies. Brad swore that Derek was the sole mastermind behind the Lumiere Spa fraud, and that Derek had manipulated Brad into approving those high-risk commercial loans. Naomi did not touch the flash drive. She simply tilted her head, maintaining a gaze so cold it made Brad physically flinch. She asked Brad why he thought she would possibly care about a flash drive when her own forensic artificial intelligence had already mapped every single fraudulent transaction Derek had ever authorized. Brad swallowed hard, a bead of sweat dripping down his temple. He shifted his strategy, aiming for a different angle. He leaned closer, lowering his voice into a conspiratorial whisper. He offered to become a star witness for the prosecution. He told Naomi that if she instructed her powerhouse legal team to negotiate a full immunity deal for him with the federal prosecutors, he would testify to absolutely anything she wanted. He promised to ensure Derek received the maximum possible prison sentence. He offered to be her ultimate weapon to completely destroy her ex-husband in federal court. Sarah finally looked up from her legal pad. She adjusted her glasses and stared at Brad with clinical disgust. She asked Brad what he intended to do about his wife. She reminded him that Kendra had been illegally receiving hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen capital to fund her luxury lifestyle. Brad did not even hesitate. The betrayal flowed from his mouth with terrifying ease. He waved his hand dismissively, his face twisting into a mask of pure contempt. He told Naomi and Sarah that Kendra was nothing but a greedy, useless parasite. He stated clearly and loudly that he had only married into the family because he believed Derek was a legitimate tech billionaire. He confessed that he despised Kendra's constant whining, her complete lack of intelligence, and her obsessive need for unearned luxury. Brad aggressively leaned over the desk, sealing his own fate. He promised Naomi that he would gladly testify against Kendra too. He swore he would provide the IRS with exact dates and locations of every single undeclared luxury asset Kendra had purchased using stolen funds. He told Naomi he did not care if his wife rotted in a federal penitentiary right next to her brother. He said he would happily serve Kendra on a silver platter as long as Naomi used her limitless resources to keep him out of a jail cell. He begged Naomi to save him, abandoning every shred of loyalty, morality, and marital devotion to save his own skin. Naomi listened to the entire cowardly performance in absolute silence. She let Brad dig his own grave, allowing him to systematically dismantle every single relationship he had left in the world. She watched the desperate, pathetic man practically hyperventilate as he waited for her response. A slow, chilling smile spread across Naomi's face. She picked up her silver fountain pen and tapped it once against the mahogany desk. It was a sharp, final sound. Naomi looked Brad dead in the eye and told him his offer was highly insightful. She praised his willingness to be completely transparent about his true motivations and his absolute lack of loyalty. She told him that his detailed confession regarding his wife's active participation in federal tax evasion was particularly valuable. Brad let out a massive, shuddering sigh of relief. He slumped back in the leather chair, a sickening grin forming on his sweaty face. He truly believed he had outsmarted the system. He believed he had successfully traded his wife and his brother-in-law for his own absolute freedom. He began to thank Naomi, praising her business acumen, completely blind to the trap that had just snapped shut around him. Naomi did not say another word. She calmly reached under the lip of her massive mahogany desk. She pressed a single concealed security button. With a soft mechanical hiss, the heavy double doors leading into the private executive lounge adjacent to her office slid open. Brad stopped talking. He turned around in his leather chair, a confused frown wrinkling his forehead. Standing perfectly still in the doorway of the lounge, flanked by a towering private security guard, was Kendra. Kendra's face was completely drained of color. Her hands were shaking so violently that her knuckles had turned stark white. She had been standing in that private room for the last 20 minutes. Naomi had arranged for Kendra to be escorted up the private freight elevator precisely when Brad arrived at the front desk. Naomi had simply left the intercom system broadcasting crystal clear audio directly into the lounge. Kendra had heard every single word. She had heard her husband call her a greedy, useless parasite. She had heard him admit he never loved her and only married her for money that did not even exist. She had heard the man she loved eagerly volunteer to send her to federal prison just to save himself. Brad froze, his mouth hanging open in sheer unadulterated terror as he stared into the devastated, enraged eyes of his betrayed wife. The heavy rain from the previous days had finally cleared, but the atmosphere inside Beatrice's ancestral suburban home was suffocating. This modest house was the absolute last remaining scrap of the family's dignity. After the massive Buckhead estate was seized and demolished, Beatrice had retreated to this smaller property she had inherited years ago. She had spent the entire morning desperately trying to regain her shattered social standing by hosting her weekly neighborhood Bible study, inviting the few churchwomen who had not yet blocked her number. She had polished her remaining silver set, out her finest china, and baked a lemon pound cake, determined to project the illusion that the family was simply downsizing by choice. While Beatrice held court in the living room, quoting scripture and acting like a resilient matriarch, Derek was hiding in the kitchen. He looked like a bruised, hollow shell of a man. Having lost his company, his luxury car, and his young mistress, he was currently surviving on instant coffee and sheer panic. A sharp knock at the kitchen door made him jump. A certified courier stood on the back porch holding a thick red stamped envelope. Derek signed for it with trembling fingers. He tore open the heavy paper and his remaining world completely collapsed. It was an emergency foreclosure notice. The bank was legally seizing the property in exactly 48 hours. Derek stared at the paperwork in absolute paralyzing terror. A year ago, desperate to keep Vanessa dripping in designer bags and to fund his fake billionaire lifestyle, he had quietly convinced Beatrice to put this inherited house up as collateral for a massive high-interest second mortgage. But Beatrice's credit was completely ruined, and Derek's own finances were entirely tied up in his fraudulent tech startup. To secure the funds, Derek had done the unthinkable. He had forged Naomi's signature as the primary financial guarantor on the mortgage documents. He had literally traced her name onto the federal bank forms using her immaculate credit score to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars. He had blown every single cent on chartered jets and diamond watches for his mistress. He knew this was a severe federal crime. If Naomi found out she was legally tied to this defaulted loan, she would not just ruin him financially, she would send him to a federal penitentiary. Derek shoved the foreclosure notice into his jacket, sprinted out the back door, and ran down the street, leaving his mother to entertain her guests, completely unaware that she was about to be thrown out onto the pavement. Derek waited outside the towering glass structure of Naomi Holdings Group like a desperate beggar. When Naomi finally walked out of the revolving doors surrounded by her elite security detail, Derek threw himself directly into her path. The guards immediately intercepted him, grabbing his arms and pinning him back, but he screamed her name, begging and crying for exactly 2 minutes of her time. Naomi stopped. She signaled her head of security to release him, stepping back to maintain a safe distance. Derek dropped heavily to his knees right there on the wet concrete of the financial district. He reached into his wrinkled jacket and pulled out a crumpled, tear-stained document. It was the finalized divorce decree. He held it up like a white flag of surrender. He told Naomi he had signed it. He promised he would waive all claims to spousal support. He swore he would walk away with absolutely nothing and disappear from her life forever. In exchange, he begged her to pay off the second mortgage on his mother's house. He confessed that the bank was foreclosing in 2 days. He sobbed, tears and snot running down his face, crying that his mother would be homeless on the street if Naomi did not write a check right now. Naomi did not flinch. She instructed her lead guard to take the divorce papers and the mortgage notice from Derek's shaking hands. She calmly reviewed the bank document. Her sharp eyes instantly locked onto the primary guarantor's signature line. There, written in clumsy blue ink, was a pathetic, obvious forgery of her own name. Naomi looked down at the weeping man kneeling in the dirt. She did not yell. She did not express outrage. She simply offered a cold, predatory smile. She told Derek that his offer was officially rejected. She informed him that she did not need to buy her freedom from him because she had already taken it. Naomi neatly folded the forged mortgage document, slipped it into her designer handbag, turned on her heel, and walked straight to her waiting black car. Derek screamed her name, begging and pleading, utterly broken on the sidewalk as her vehicle pulled away. Naomi sat in the plush leather seat of her luxury SUV. She did not call her civil lawyers. She bypassed her corporate legal team entirely. She picked up her phone and dialed a direct private line to the district attorney's office. She informed the lead prosecutor that she had just acquired irrefutable physical evidence of grand theft identity fraud and felony forgery committed by Derek. She ordered her driver to head straight to the courthouse. She handed the original forged document directly to a financial crimes investigator. The district attorney's office, already circling Derek for the massive Lumiere spa fraud, immediately fast-tracked a federal arrest warrant. Back at the suburban house, Beatrice was pouring Earl Grey tea for 5 extremely judgmental women from her church. She was smiling brightly, pretending her life was completely perfect, bragging about how resilient her family was in the face of adversity. She lifted her teacup, preparing to offer a toast to her faith. The quiet, refined afternoon was violently shattered by the deafening roar of sirens. Not 1, but 4 marked police cruisers aggressively jumped the curb and skidded to a halt right on Beatrice's perfectly manicured front lawn. Bright red and blue lights flashed wildly, illuminating the lace curtains of the living room. Heavy, armored fists began pounding mercilessly on the front door, accompanied by a booming voice over a police megaphone shouting for Derek to step outside with his hands in the air. The cover of Capital Horizon magazine hit newsstands the following Tuesday. The publication was the undisputed Bible of the East Coast financial sector, a glossy, high-profile magazine read by every major CEO, venture capitalist, and hedge fund manager from Wall Street to Buckhead. The cover featured a stark, commanding portrait of Naomi sitting at the head of her custom mahogany conference table. The headline, printed in bold, uncompromising silver text, read, "The Invisible Architect: How Naomi Holdings Group Built a $2 billion fintech empire in Absolute Secrecy." Inside, the 14-page exposé was a masterpiece of financial journalism. The reporter had spent the last 2 weeks interviewing Naomi's top executives, reviewing SEC filings, and verifying the explosive growth of Aegis Financial. The article meticulously detailed Naomi's ascent from a brilliant analyst to an apex predator in the private equity sector. It mapped her aggressive acquisition strategy, her proprietary AI algorithm that predicted toxic debt, and her ruthless efficiency in restructuring failing companies. However, it was the second half of the article that truly detonated across the business world. The journalist had uncovered the massive blind trust Naomi had used to fund Lumiere, the tech startup helmed by her now disgraced ex-husband Derek. The article did not hold back. It laid bare the staggering, almost comical dynamic of their marriage. It detailed how Naomi, operating as a silent, anonymous angel investor, had systematically pumped millions of dollars into Derek's failing, poorly coded software company, artificially inflating its valuation to $50 million simply to keep him occupied. The exposé painted a devastating picture of Derek. He was not framed as a tragic victim. He was exposed as a parasitic, profoundly arrogant fraud. The article quoted anonymous former employees of Lumiere, who described Derek strutting around his leased office, boasting about his genius and his self-made wealth, completely blind to the reality that his entire existence was subsidized by the very woman he treated like a low-level administrative assistant. The financial community devoured the story. It was the ultimate cautionary tale of hubris, a spectacular public vivisection of an entitled tech bro who had bitten the hand that fed him and choked to death on his own ego. Derek sat on the edge of a sagging, stained mattress in a cheap extended-stay motel on the outskirts of Atlanta. He had managed to scrape together enough cash by pawning his remaining designer watches to afford a week's rent. The room smelled of mildew and stale desperation. He stared blankly at his laptop screen, the bright white light illuminating the deep dark circles under his bloodshot eyes. He was reading the digital version of the Capital Horizon article. His hands shook so violently that he could barely scroll down the page. Every sentence was a brutal, merciless strike against his fragile ego. He read the quotes from his former developers laughing about his useless stolen code. He saw the exact itemized list of cash injections Naomi had authorized to save his company from bankruptcy month after month. The illusion he had built his entire identity around, the brilliant self-made tech visionary, was publicly, permanently annihilated. He was a joke. He was a cautionary tale. He was the most famous fraud in Atlanta. Panic seized him. He needed an ally. He needed anyone to validate his existence. Derek snatched his cell phone from the cheap laminate nightstand. He opened his contacts list, his thumb hovering over the names of the few remaining friends he had left in the tech sector. These were the guys he used to drink scotch with at exclusive rooftop bars, the guys he used to brag to about his impending move to Silicon Valley. He tapped the name of his former co-founder, a man named Greg, who had left Lumiere a year ago to start his own consulting firm. The line rang once, twice. Then a sharp, flat tone signaled that the call had been disconnected. Derek frowned, assuming it was a bad connection. He dialed again. This time, the call went straight to an automated voicemail message. Derek's breath hitched. He quickly drafted a text message to Greg asking if they could grab a beer and talk about a new project. He hit send. Immediately, a harsh red error notification popped up on the screen. Message not delivered. Greg had blocked him. Derek frantically scrolled down his contacts list. He dialed the number of his former lead engineer, a brilliant coder who used to idolize him. The call went straight to voicemail. He sent a text. Message not delivered. He dialed the number of a wealthy angel investor he used to play golf with at the Piedmont Elite Country Club. Straight to voicemail. Message not delivered. He dialed his former public relations manager. Straight to voicemail. Message not delivered. Derek dropped the phone onto the stained mattress. A cold, suffocating terror gripped his chest. He finally understood the absolute, total isolation of his situation. The Capital Horizon article had not just ruined his reputation, It had rendered him completely fundamentally radioactive. No one in the business community would ever return his calls. No one would ever hire him. No one would ever want to be seen in the same room as the man who had been so spectacularly publicly exposed as a subsidized fraud. The tech genius was entirely gone, replaced by a ghost that the entire city of Atlanta was actively trying to forget. The midday sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of El Etoile Buckhead's most exclusive dining room. Naomi sat at her preferred corner booth, a secluded enclave of velvet and polished brass. She was dressed in a sharp burgundy silk blouse, reviewing a quarterly acquisition report on her tablet. The restaurant hummed with the quiet, expensive murmur of Atlanta's elite closing deals over Wagyu beef and imported truffles. It was a space designed for power, and Naomi commanded her corner of it effortlessly. The serene atmosphere was violently disrupted by the sound of scuffling heels and an increasingly frantic voice at the host stand. Naomi did not look up immediately, but her peripheral vision caught the commotion. A woman was aggressively pushing past the horrified hostess, practically sprinting through the maze of white tablecloths. It was Kendra. The arrogant, entitled woman who had gleefully packed Naomi's belongings into cardboard boxes 5 years ago was entirely unrecognizable. Kendra looked completely ravaged. Her Burberry trench coat was severely wrinkled and out of season. The designer handbag she clutched like a life preserver was noticeably scuffed at the corners. She had lost the arrogant glow of unearned wealth. Her divorce from Brad, who was currently fighting a losing battle against federal embezzlement charges, had left her completely destitute. The IRS had frozen her assets, seized her undeclared luxury vehicles, and systematically stripped her of every single comfort she had ever known. Kendra reached Naomi's table, her chest heaving as she gasped for breath. She did not wait for an invitation. She practically collapsed into the velvet booth across from Naomi, gripping the edge of the brass table with trembling hands. Naomi did not flinch. She calmly locked her tablet, set it face down on the table, and looked at her former sister-in-law with an expression of absolute terrifying indifference. Kendra tried to force a smile, but it looked more like a grimace of pain. She launched into a frantic, overly familiar monologue, attempting to completely rewrite the last half-decade of history. She leaned across the table, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet, desperate brand of false solidarity. She told Naomi that she had finally seen the light. Kendra claimed that Brad had manipulated her just like Derek had manipulated Naomi. She painted a pathetic, entirely fictional picture of the two of them as shared victims of toxic, lying men. Kendra reached her hand across the table, attempting to grab Naomi's wrist, preaching about how Black women needed to stick together in a ruthless corporate world. She begged Naomi to remember that they were still family. She sobbed, detailing how she was losing her house, how her credit was ruined, and how none of her wealthy socialite friends would return her calls. Then came the ultimate delusional pitch. Kendra wiped a tear from her eye and begged Naomi for a job, not just any job, but a senior executive position at Naomi Holdings Group. She claimed that her years of hosting charity galas and country club brunches had given her exceptional public relations skills. She promised she would be an incredible asset to the corporate team, demanding a 6-figure salary and a corner office to help her get back on her feet. Naomi let the desperate silence hang in the air for a long, agonizing moment. She signaled a passing waiter with a subtle gesture of her hand. The waiter approached immediately, bowing his head respectfully. Naomi ordered a black coffee for Kendra and handed the waiter a crisp $100 bill, explicitly telling him to keep the change and to leave the coffee on the table. It was the ultimate devastating display of charity. She was paying for Kendra's coffee up front, silently communicating that Kendra was nothing more than a beggar off the street. The waiter returned seconds later, placing the coffee cup in front of a completely humiliated Kendra. Naomi finally spoke, her voice smooth, precise, and completely devoid of mercy. She told Kendra that her speech about sisterhood and female solidarity was a fascinating piece of fiction. Naomi reminded Kendra of the exact words spoken in the living room 5 years ago. She repeated Kendra's mocking advice to go find a new sugar daddy. She reminded Kendra how much she had laughed while kicking Naomi out into the freezing rain. Naomi firmly stated that they were not sisters. They were not victims sharing a common struggle. They were not family. Naomi looked Kendra dead in the eye and stated that Kendra had happily gorged herself on the stolen money Derek had funneled to her for years. She had enjoyed every single second of her unearned luxury, and now she was simply choking on the bill. However, Naomi continued, her tone shifting to a mockingly professional cadence. She said she did believe in providing opportunities for desperate people who were willing to put in the actual work. Naomi reached into her designer briefcase. She did not pull out an executive employment contract. She did not pull out a checkbook. She pulled out a single generic sheet of copy paper. She slid it across the polished table until it rested right next to Kendra's charity coffee. It was a standard entry-level employment application. Naomi explained the position with clinical detachment. She informed Kendra that one of her smallest, lowest-performing subsidiary companies, a waste management and commercial sanitation logistics firm operating out of a warehouse in an industrial park, had an opening. It was a frontline secretarial position. The job paid $15 an hour. Kendra would be required to clock in at 6 in the morning, answer phones for angry sanitation drivers, and fetch coffee for the shift supervisors. Naomi stated that if Kendra filled out the application correctly, she would personally guarantee her an interview with the warehouse manager. Kendra stared at the piece of paper. The sheer overwhelming insult of the offer broke through her pathetic facade. The realization that she was being offered a minimum wage job answering phones at a garbage facility completely shattered her fragile, entitled ego. Kendra's face twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged rage. She shot up from the velvet booth, her chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. She screamed at the top of her lungs, completely abandoning any pretense of public decency. She shrieked that she had a college degree, that she was a former vice president's sister, and that she was vastly superior to sweeping floors and fetching coffee for common laborers. With a furious, theatrical swipe of her arm, Kendra grabbed the job application and threw it forcefully onto the restaurant floor. She knocked her coffee cup over in the process, sending dark liquid spilling across the pristine white tablecloth and dripping down onto her own scuffed shoes. She screamed that Naomi was a heartless, vindictive monster. The entire dining room fell dead silent. Every wealthy patron in L'Etoile stopped eating, turning to stare at the hysterical, completely out of control woman causing a massive scene. Before Naomi even had to signal her security detail, the restaurant's general manager stepped swiftly out of the shadows. The manager was a polished, formidable woman and a close personal friend of Naomi's. She was flanked by two massive, immaculately dressed bouncers. The manager did not politely ask Kendra to lower her voice. She stepped directly into Kendra's personal space, her expression carved from stone. She told Kendra that her behavior was entirely unacceptable and that she was currently trespassing in a private establishment. The manager looked down at the spilled coffee and the crumpled application on the floor, then looked back at Kendra with absolute disgust. The manager pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly toward the exit. She loudly and publicly informed Kendra that she was permanently banned from the restaurant and all of its affiliated properties across the city. The two security guards grabbed Kendra by the arms, completely ignoring her frantic, shrieking protests, and began dragging her forcefully through the dining room toward the front doors. The harsh buzzing hum of the fluorescent lights inside the Fulton County holding facility was a stark contrast to the classical music playing at the restaurant Kendra had just been thrown out of. Derek sat hunched on a bolted steel bench, staring blankly at the stained concrete floor. His custom-tailored suit, previously soaked in the freezing Atlanta rain during his arrest on his mother's front lawn, had dried into a stiff, foul-smelling shell. He was shivering violently, entirely stripped of his phone, his leather wallet, his luxury watch, and his massive ego. The tech visionary had been reduced to a federal inmate processing number. A heavy-set guard banged a metal baton against the iron bars of the holding cell. The sharp, echoing clang made Derek jump in terror. The guard announced that Derek was permitted his single legally mandated phone call. Derek stood on trembling legs, his ruined leather shoes dragging across the concrete as the guard escorted him down the sterile processing corridor to a wall-mounted telephone. Derek's hands shook so violently he could barely lift the heavy plastic receiver. He punched in the only phone number he still knew by heart. He dialed Naomi's personal cell. He closed his eyes, pressing his sweaty forehead against the cold cinder block wall, praying to a god he had ignored for years that she had not completely blocked his number. The line rang once. It rang twice. Then the ringing stopped. She answered. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute, terrifying, and heavy with unspoken power. Derek did not wait for a greeting. He immediately began to weep, loud, ragged sobs echoing down the prison hallway. He launched into a frantic, breathless plea for mercy. He begged her to forgive him. He swore that he had been manipulated by the intense pressure of the tech industry and the toxic influence of his mother. He cried that he would do absolutely anything she wanted, sign any document, surrender any asset, if she would just make a phone call and drop the criminal charges. He promised they could start over, that he would be the supportive, loyal husband she deserved. Naomi did not interrupt his pathetic, groveling performance. She let him beg until his voice cracked. Then she spoke a single, perfectly calm sentence. She told him she would be there shortly, and the line went dead. An hour later, a guard escorted Derek into a sterile, windowless visitor interrogation room. Derek sat in a hard plastic chair, staring at the heavily scarred metal table bolted to the center of the floor. His heart pounded wildly in his chest. He firmly believed his desperate phone call had worked. He convinced himself that Naomi still loved him, that her appearance here meant she was bringing her powerhouse legal team to negotiate his immediate release. The heavy steel door clicked loudly and swung open. Derek gasped, his eyes widening in profound shock. Naomi walked into the cold interrogation room. She was not flanked by armed security guards. She was not accompanied by her ruthless general counsel. Most shockingly, she was not wearing one of her razor-sharp billion-dollar executive suits. Naomi was wearing a simple, understated navy blue dress. It was the exact same dress she had worn to their 5th anniversary dinner at the high-end steakhouse. It was the dress Derek had mocked, telling his mother it made Naomi look like a bored, low-level secretary. It was the dress she was wearing when he had confidently slid a manila envelope across a white tablecloth and told her she lacked the ambition to be a tech CEO's partner. The visual impact struck Derek like a physical blow. Naomi's posture was flawless, her expression an impenetrable mask of pure calm. She sat down gracefully in the plastic chair across from him, resting her designer tote bag on the floor. Derek immediately lunged forward, pressing his chest against the edge of the metal table. He started apologizing profusely, repeating the frantic promises he had made on the phone. He praised her brilliance, claiming he had been blind and foolish not to see her true worth. He swore he would sign away all marital assets and walk away with nothing, just like he had promised outside her corporate headquarters. He begged her to call the district attorney and cancel the arrest warrant so he could go home. Naomi sat perfectly still. She did not raise her voice. She did not offer a single word of comfort or condemnation. She simply watched him sweat and beg, allowing him to exhaust his final reserves of desperate, manipulative energy. When Derek finally ran out of breath, staring at her with wide, bloodshot eyes, Naomi slowly unzipped her designer tote bag. She reached inside. She did not pull out a thick binder of forensic evidence. She did not pull out a corporate settlement agreement. She pulled out a plain, standard manila envelope. Naomi placed her manicured hand on top of the envelope and slid it smoothly across the cold metal table until it rested directly in front of Derek's trembling hands. The motion was a flawless, chilling mirror image of the exact way he had ended their marriage. Derek stared at the envelope, his heart soaring with overwhelming hope. He tore the flap open, ripping the paper in his frantic haste. He pulled out the thick stack of legal documents inside. He recognized the formatting immediately. It was the finalized divorce decree. He flipped rapidly through the pages, his eyes scanning the dense legal text until he reached the final sheet. There, sitting perfectly on the signature line, was Naomi's immaculate, legally binding signature. Derek let out a loud, shuddering sob of pure relief. Tears streamed down his dirty face, splashing onto the harsh metal table. He looked up at Naomi, his face twisting into an expression of profound, pathetic gratitude. He thanked her repeatedly, weeping, that he knew she still cared, thanking her for dropping the case and saving his life. He babbled about how quickly they could get the bank fraud charges dismissed, now that the marital dispute was officially settled. Naomi slowly stood up from the hard plastic chair. She smoothed out the skirt of her navy blue dress with absolute deliberate precision. She leaned across the metal table, bringing her face just inches from his. The terrified hope in Derek's eyes locked onto her cold, unblinking gaze. She spoke in a perfectly calm, chilling whisper that echoed loudly in the small concrete room. "I signed the divorce. But the fraud charges are federal. I have no power to drop them. Enjoy your new lifestyle." The oppressive Georgia heat clung to the damp, peeling wallpaper of the cramped one-bedroom apartment in an unforgiving layer of misery. Beatrice sat on a sagging floral sofa she had been forced to purchase from a discount thrift store. The fabric smelled faintly of stale cigarette smoke and mildew. Gone were the imported Italian marble floors and the vaulted ceilings of her Buckhead estate. Gone were the Sunday brunches at the Piedmont Elite Country Club. Her entire kingdom had been reduced to a claustrophobic box on the wrong side of the city, where the only view from her single grime-streaked window was a brick wall and a rusted fire escape. Kendra paced the narrow strip of cheap linoleum flooring in the adjoining kitchenette. She wore faded sweatpants and a stained t-shirt, a brutal departure from the designer labels she used to demand. She was aggressively tapping her phone, trying desperately to connect to a neighbor's unsecured wireless network because they could no longer afford their own internet bill. Kendra complained bitterly about the heat, about the smell of the apartment, and about the sheer unfairness of her situation. She cursed Brad by name loudly. Her husband was currently sitting in a holding cell, frantically trying to secure a plea deal by turning over every shred of evidence he possessed against his former banking colleagues. Beatrice tuned out her daughter's frantic complaining. She stared blankly ahead, clutching a chipped ceramic mug filled with generic store-bought tea. It was a pathetic substitute for the fine Earl Grey she used to sip from bone china, but it was all they had left. The matriarch, who had once ruled her social circle with an iron fist, now spent her days hiding behind locked doors, terrified of running into anyone who had witnessed her spectacular public downfall. Across the country, Derek was wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. He was sitting in a federal penitentiary, awaiting trial for wire fraud and forgery, completely stripped of his tech visionary delusion. His desperate pleas for bail had been denied. The family was entirely fractured, destroyed by their own bottomless greed and arrogance. In the corner of the dim apartment, a bulky, outdated television set hummed loudly. Beatrice had purchased it from a pawn shop, using the last few crumpled $20 bills in her wallet. The screen flickered with static, occasionally rolling with lines of distortion. It was tuned to a national news network, providing meaningless background noise to drown out the oppressive silence of their ruined lives. Beatrice brought the chipped mug to her lips, seeking a tiny measure of comfort. Suddenly, the upbeat commercial break ended. The news broadcast cut sharply to the financial desk. The anchor's voice, crisp and energetic, broke through the dull rattle of the broken box fan oscillating in the window. The anchor announced that Wall Street was bracing for the most highly anticipated financial event of the decade. Beatrice froze. The tea burned her throat as she swallowed, but she did not look away from the flickering screen. The news graphic changed, displaying a massive, bold logo that Beatrice recognized instantly. It was the gold and black insignia of Naomi Holdings Group. The anchor enthusiastically reported that the private equity juggernaut, which had aggressively absorbed dozens of major commercial assets over the past 5 years, was officially executing its initial public offering on the New York Stock Exchange. The financial analysts on the panel discussed the unprecedented valuation. The numbers they threw out were astronomical. They spoke of billions in secured assets, flawless forensic algorithms, and an acquisition strategy that had completely redefined the East Coast financial sector. Kendra stopped pacing. She dropped her phone onto the cheap laminate counter. She walked slowly into the living area, her eyes wide and fixed on the television screen. Neither woman spoke. They were completely paralyzed, held hostage by the broadcast taking place hundreds of miles away. The newsfeed transitioned from the studio desk to a live aerial shot of Wall Street. The camera zoomed in on the iconic facade of the New York Stock Exchange. The building was draped in massive vertical banners bearing the name of the woman they had thrown out into the rain. The broadcast cut directly to the interior of the exchange. The trading floor was an absolute sea of roaring, cheering brokers and executives. The camera panned up to the famous balcony overlooking the chaos. Standing at the absolute center of the podium, radiating a level of power and authority that transcended wealth, was Naomi. She was not the quiet, submissive wife who used to fetch coffee for Derek. She was not the target of Beatrice's cruel, relentless mockery. Naomi wore a breathtaking, custom-tailored crimson suit that commanded the attention of every single person in the room. Her posture was immaculate, her chin held high, her expression a flawless mask of absolute triumph. Flanking her on the podium was her fiercely loyal inner circle. Sarah stood to her right, smiling sharply at the cameras. Hayes, the massive head of security, stood dutifully in the background, ensuring no one breached the perimeter. These were the people who had fought beside her, the team she had elevated and protected. They looked at Naomi with genuine, profound respect. The anchor's voiceover detailed how Naomi had built this empire from the ground up entirely in secret, while navigating incredible personal adversity. The world was finally seeing her for exactly who she was. She was the apex predator of the financial world, a self-made titan who had conquered an industry designed to keep women exactly like her out. The digital clock on the trading floor hit the exact opening hour. Naomi stepped forward. She placed her hand firmly on the polished wooden gavel. She looked directly into the primary broadcast camera, her eyes piercing through the lens and beaming straight into the squalid, run-down apartment in Georgia. A brilliant, victorious smile broke across her face. She brought the gavel down hard. The heavy brass opening bell rang out with a deafening, triumphant sound. A massive explosion of white and gold confetti rained down from the ceiling, covering the cheering crowd. The digital ticker boards instantly lit up, blazing a bright, vibrant green as Naomi Holdings Group went public, breaking trading records within the first 10 seconds. The sheer magnitude of her success, the absolute undeniable proof of her immense power, washed over the live feed. In the dark, stifling apartment, Beatrice watched the confetti fall. The undeniable reality of what she had thrown away crashed down on her with crushing, suffocating weight. She had possessed a genuine billionaire in her own home. She had possessed a brilliant, powerful daughter-in-law who could have elevated their entire family to unprecedented heights. Instead, Beatrice had chosen to worship a fraudulent son and a shallow daughter, driving away the only person who actually held the keys to the kingdom. Beatrice's trembling hands lost all their strength, her fingers went completely numb. The chipped ceramic teacup slipped from her grasp. It plummeted toward the cheap linoleum floor, hitting the hard surface with a sharp, violent crack. The cheap mug shattered into dozens of jagged, useless pieces, sending lukewarm, generic tea splashing across Beatrice's bare feet. She did not flinch. She did not move to clean it up. She simply sat in the dark, staring at the broken pieces on the floor, completely destroyed by the resounding echo of Naomi's ultimate victory. 3 years evaporated the last remnants of the toxic past, leaving behind a life built on absolute clarity and unshakable power. The sprawling beachfront estate on Martha's Vineyard was no longer just a personal sanctuary. Tonight it served as the venue for the Apex Foundation's annual philanthropic gala. The foundation, designed to provide massive capital grants to minority women in finance and technology, was Naomi's proudest achievement. The ocean breeze swept across the manicured lawns, carrying the soft sound of a live jazz quartet playing on the terrace. Naomi stood in the master suite, looking at her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. She radiated a profound, untouchable peace. The relentless defensive armor she had worn during her marriage to Derek was completely gone. She was wealthy beyond measure, but her true triumph was the absolute serenity in her heart. A gentle knock at the door preceded the arrival of Julian. Julian was a renowned sustainable architect, a man whose brilliance was matched only by his deep, unwavering respect for her. They had been engaged for 6 months. Unlike the men of her past, Julian never competed with her success. He celebrated it. He walked up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and kissed her cheek. He told her she looked breathtaking and that the charity board was already buzzing about the record-breaking donations pouring in. He looked at her not as a stepping stone or a bank account, but as a true equal. Naomi smiled, feeling a profound sense of gratitude for a partner who finally understood the definition of unconditional support. Downstairs in the sprawling industrial chef's kitchen, the catering staff was operating in a state of controlled chaos. The event company hired for the gala was the most exclusive on the East Coast, demanding absolute perfection from its servers. Among the temporary staff hired specifically for the evening rush was a man who kept his head down and his mouth shut. Derek smoothed the front of his stiff, ill-fitting white service jacket. 36 months in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud had completely destroyed him. The prison sentence had carved deep, harsh lines into his face, aging him a decade in 3 years. His hair had thinned dramatically, fading to a dull, sickly gray. The arrogant swagger of the fake tech visionary was entirely dead, replaced by the nervous, twitchy energy of a man terrified of violating his parole. He was currently living in a cramped halfway house, scrubbing toilets and picking up catering gigs just to satisfy his probation officer and avoid being sent back to a concrete cell. Derek had no idea who owned this massive estate. The temporary staffing agency simply gave him an address and ordered him not to make eye contact with the billionaire guests. He picked up a heavy silver tray loaded with 30 crystal champagne flutes, focusing all of his limited concentration on balancing the expensive glassware. He was exhausted, humiliated, and completely broken, but he desperately needed the hourly wage to afford his weekly bus pass. The gala was officially beginning. Julian headed downstairs to greet the first wave of arriving guests, leaving Naomi to make her grand entrance. Naomi stepped out of her suite and walked toward the top of the grand marble staircase. She wore a custom crimson silk gown. The bodice was hand-embroidered with thousands of tiny flawless diamonds that caught the ambient light of the chandeliers, sparkling like crushed stars. She looked like absolute royalty. Derek pushed through the swinging service doors, balancing the heavy silver tray on his shoulder. He stepped out into the grand foyer, keeping his eyes glued to the polished marble floor. He moved carefully toward the reception area, terrified of dropping the tray and losing his job. The low murmur of the arriving guests suddenly hushed. A collective wave of awe rippled through the foyer as the attendees looked up toward the sweeping staircase. Derek instinctively followed their gaze, allowing his eyes to lift from the floor. He looked up at the top of the marble stairs. The breath was violently punched out of his lungs. His heart stopped completely. He stared at the woman descending the steps, wrapped in crimson silk and diamonds. It was Naomi, the woman he had called lazy, the woman he had handed divorce papers to in a crowded restaurant, the woman whose money he had stolen to fund his pathetic fake empire. She was a goddess radiating absolute power, completely out of his reach, occupying a universe he could not even fathom. Standing at the bottom of the stairs, waiting for her with a look of pure adoration, was a handsome, successful man who clearly worshipped the ground she walked on. Naomi smiled down at Julian, completely unaware of the ruined, paroled catering server standing in the shadows. Derek's brain short-circuited. The sheer, overwhelming realization of what he had thrown away hit him with the force of a speeding train. The psychological shock paralyzed his nervous system. He opened his mouth, his dry lips parting as he tried to whisper her name. His hands went completely numb. He lost all feeling in his fingers. The heavy silver tray tipped forward. Derek could not catch it. 30 crystal flutes filled with expensive vintage champagne plummeted toward the ground. The tray hit the pristine marble floor with a deafening, violent crash. Glass shattered everywhere, sending a massive wave of sparkling shards and spilled champagne exploding across the foyer. The loud, destructive noise echoed through the silent mansion, bringing the entire gala to a dead stop. The deafening crash of 30 crystal flutes shattering against imported marble sucked all the oxygen out of the grand foyer. The elegant jazz music spilling from the terrace abruptly ceased. Hundreds of hushed, high-stakes conversations among the East Coast elite died instantly. Every single eye in the sprawling mansion snapped toward the epicenter of the destruction. Women in designer gowns took swift steps backward, shielding their expensive hems from the spreading wave of vintage champagne. Derek dropped heavily to his knees. His palms slammed into the freezing pool of alcohol and jagged shards of glass. A sharp piece of crystal sliced deep into the base of his thumb, but he did not register the physical pain. A suffocating, blinding terror consumed his entire nervous system. He scrambled frantically on the wet floor, sweeping broken glass into his trembling hands, desperately trying to erase the massive mistake he had just made. His heart hammered violently against his ribs. This was a direct violation of his parole terms, causing a public disturbance, destroying expensive property, creating a scene at a billionaire's charity gala. He was going straight back to federal prison. The halfway house would report him immediately. The catering company would press charges for the financial damages. He was completely, irrevocably ruined. But the legal consequences paled in comparison to the psychological execution he was currently bracing for. He kept his head bowed, his hands bleeding onto the pristine white marble. He heard the unmistakable rhythmic click of designer heels descending the grand staircase. Naomi was coming down. The woman he had relentlessly degraded, the woman he had kicked out into the freezing Atlanta rain, the woman who had meticulously orchestrated the total annihilation of his life. She was walking right toward him. Derek squeezed his eyes shut tightly. He waited for the booming, theatrical humiliation. He expected her to stop right in front of the entire assembly of venture capitalists and bank presidents to publicly announce exactly who he was. He braced himself for her to tell the elite crowd that the pathetic bleeding waiter groveling on the floor was the fraudulent tech CEO who had tried to steal her massive fortune. He prepared himself to be verbally eviscerated, expecting her to relish the absolute perfection of this revenge. He wanted to beg for mercy, to plead for her not to call his probation officer, but his vocal cords were completely paralyzed. The clicking of the heels stopped. Naomi stood at the bottom of the stairs, the hem of her diamond-studded crimson gown hovering just a fraction of an inch above the spreading puddle of champagne. Julian stood beside her, a steady and protective presence, silently observing the ruined catering server making a bloody mess of the opulent foyer. Derek slowly, agonizingly lifted his heavy head, his breath hitched in his throat. He looked up at the stunning, powerful woman towering over him. The ambient lighting caught the diamonds on her bodice, practically blinding him with their brilliance. He opened his mouth, his jaw trembling uncontrollably. He tried to form the word Naomi, but only a pathetic, raspy exhale escaped his dry lips. He wanted her to scream at him. He wanted her to curse his name. He wanted her to show even a singular ounce of hatred, because hatred would mean he still mattered. Hatred would mean he still occupied a space in her mind. Naomi looked down. Her dark, piercing eyes locked onto his weathered face. Derek stared back, his heart stopping in his chest. He searched her flawless expression, desperately waiting for the spark of recognition, the cold smirk of victory, the triumphant flash of a predator finally trapping its prey. There was absolutely nothing. Naomi's eyes were completely, devastatingly blank. Her brow did not furrow. Her lips did not twitch into a smirk. The gaze she directed at him was the exact same mild, detached annoyance one might reserve for a misplaced piece of furniture or a stubborn stain on a rug. She did not see her ex-husband. She did not see the man who had tormented her family. She did not see the arrogant tech bro who had once commanded her to pay a $2,000 dinner bill. She only saw an anonymous, clumsy catering server who had ruined the aesthetic of her immaculate entryway. She had entirely forgotten him. He was thoroughly, permanently erased from her neural pathways. He had been relegated to the absolute bottom of her history, buried so deep under billions of dollars and profound inner peace that his face no longer registered in her memory. The realization was a lethal localized nuclear strike to Derek's soul. It was a punishment far more agonizing than any screaming match or public shaming could ever be. He was entirely insignificant. Naomi did not address him. She did not speak to the broken man bleeding on her floor. Instead, she smoothly turned her head toward the massive, broad-shouldered man standing a few feet away. "Hayes," she said, her voice projecting absolute unbothered authority through the silent foyer. Her head of security stepped forward immediately, his posture rigid with professional respect. "Yes, Miss Brooks," he responded rapidly. Naomi gestured vaguely toward the chaotic, sparkling mess of broken crystal and the shivering man kneeling in the center of it. She delivered her instruction with a calm, surgical precision that echoed flawlessly off the vaulted ceiling. "Have the catering manager send someone else?" she commanded, her tone devoid of any emotion. "This one is just taking up space." Derek gasped, the air knocked completely out of his lungs. The exact words he had hurled at her 5 years ago in his mother's living room had just been weaponized and fired back with lethal accuracy. But it was not a calculated callback for her. It was simply the absolute undeniable truth of the present moment. He was nothing but a physical obstruction in her beautiful, thriving world. Julian gently offered his arm. Naomi placed her manicured hand gracefully on his sleeve. Without another word, without a single backward glance, she stepped smoothly around the puddle of ruined champagne. She walked completely past Derek, the trailing silk of her crimson gown, brushing inches from his bleeding, desperate hands. As she approached the heavy oak double doors leading to the grand terrace, the private security detail pushed them wide open. The cool, salty ocean breeze rushed into the foyer. The jazz quartet immediately struck up a vibrant, triumphant chord. The hundreds of elite guests waiting outside erupted into a deafening, roaring wave of applause, cheering wildly for the billionaire philanthropist who had just graced them with her presence. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind her, sealing the brilliant sound and the golden light outside. Derek remained on his hands and knees in the dim, empty foyer. He stared down at his reflection in a jagged, broken piece of crystal. He was shivering in his cheap, stained uniform, surrounded by a mess he could not afford to clean up. The distant, muffled sound of people celebrating a woman who owned the world filtered through the thick mansion walls. He dropped his head, letting the reality of his absolute destruction wash over him. He was completely invisible, forever trapped in the massive, untouchable shadow she cast.